was he the killer. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because...
Oh, wait a minute. Thing stopped. No.
That's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please go on an amazing vacation with the like button and volunteer to take pictures for them. Every
Oh,
time
you're
you take their
feeling
picture,
thankful?
turn
That's
the camera
great.
around
Just like a
secretly
turkey
and
at
just take
Thanksgiving.
selfies of
Gratitude
yourself.
suits
Also,
you.
please subscribe
Let's
to our
gobble up that
channel, turn on
appreciation
all
for OK
notifications.
Best.
Thank you
Hey
for
there,
the
Frederick
follow.
Frazier.
How are we doing?
Thanks for following. You're
Okay,
the cherry
let's get
on top
into
of this
today's
streaming
story.
Sunday. Let's rock. And roll together.
Alright, we're zombies and true crime today, you guys. I'm working on prestiging some guns.
On March 11th, 1974, 22-year-old Barbara Rocky sat at
How
her
are you
desk in her
guys
bedroom
doing
in
today?
Provo, Utah, writing furiously. And as she was writing, eventually she paused for a minute to reread what she had written, but she wasn't quite happy yet, so she added a few more lines. The letter she was writing was for her roommates, and she knew it had to be perfect, because Barbara was saying goodbye. So Barbara was a junior at Brigham Young University, or BYU, which was a very religious school where most students were practicing Mormons, but not Barbara. She had chosen to go to BYU because of religion, but really just because she was fascinated by it and thought going to a school structured around faith would be very interesting. But when she actually got there, she immediately felt out of place because her classmates went to church every week for hours at a time and all followed a pretty strict set of behavioral rules and values, which wasn't really Barbara's thing. Barbara was from California, considered herself more of a free spirit who liked exploring new ideas and trying new things. So over the last 3 years, Barbara had felt both frustrated and alienated by the other students' very rigid lifestyles. She'd been hoping that that would change with her new living situation. She'd just moved in with 7 other girls in January. But now, just 2 months into that, it was already very obvious that those girls did not like her. They were just as religious as the rest of the kids at BYU, and they seemed to think Barbara was weird for doing things like dating around and experimenting with different religions. It just didn't make sense to them. So Barbara had decided that instead of trying to change her roommates' minds, she would just lean into this kind of weird behavior, as they called it. Barbara basically started making them uncomfortable on purpose, like by saying she prayed to the devil, which totally shocked her. And after a while, Barbara had really got the sense that these girls, they weren't just weirded out by her, they were now actively scared of her, which really alienated Barbara a whole lot more. And so all of that was why Barbara was now writing this letter. She was telling her roommates that
Okay,
she was just going to go ahead and leave campus for a
I
while
guess I just
to
need
be
to go
with
ahead and
people
level
that
up my gun
actually
anyway.
understood
That's
her.
fine.
And the people she was
This
thinking
gun
of
is
were people
prestige
like
too.
Richard
I'm just trying to
Finder,
prestige
a
max it
self-proclaimed
at this
psychic
point.
that Barbara had connected with after she had called into a radio show where Richard had been giving psychic readings. And the two of them had connected immediately, because even though Richard was almost a decade older than her, he understood Barbara in a way that no one else in her life did. And ever since, they'd had this really intense relationship that felt both romantic and spiritual at the same time. But since Richard lived far away, most of their relationship so far had been over the phone. And so Barbara thought it might be nice to be physically closer to Richard and also his circle of friends. There was another reason Barbara wanted to get away from BYU. That was because she had started to feel
Oh, my
unsafe
aim is
being a
not
woman
where
on
it
a
should
college
be right
campus.
now.
So recently there had been some scary national news stories about college women being attacked on campus. One student in Washington State had been beaten and almost killed in her dorm room in January. And another woman had gone missing the following month. And even though these attacks had not literally happened at BYU, it still freaked Barbara out. I mean, especially because these women who had been targeted just looked a lot like her physically, with long dark hair and sort of similar features. And so as a precaution, Barbara had been taking judo classes at school and even got her best friend, Jerry Hicker, to help her buy a gun. Except Barbara had actually lost her gun recently. She'd not been able to find it for the last few weeks. She'd reported it missing to the campus police, but she really had no idea where it went. But for now, Barbara forgot about the gun and just took a deep breath and finished up her goodbye letter. Then she glanced over at the clock and saw it was almost 10 a.m., and so she had to get to class. So she grabbed the letter and put it inside of her purse, where she also was holding a turquoise necklace, which she planned to sell that day. It was the single most valuable thing that she owned, and she was going to pawn it to get some seed money to leave town. She'd figure out her actual destination based on how much she got for it. As Barbara threw her bag over her shoulder and got ready to leave, she heard a car pull into the driveway outside, which was a relief because she'd actually let her best friend Jerry borrow her car to go skiing the other day, and she had been hoping he would drop it off before she left for class, and so clearly that's what he was doing. And so Barbara hurried out her front door, and sure enough, there was her car, and there was Jerry climbing out and waving her keys, basically being like, "Hey, I'm back." As Jerry handed the car keys back over to Barbara, he asked her if they were still on for hanging out later. But Barbara was busy thinking about getting to class and the logistics of selling her necklace. She had decided that Salt Lake City would have more pawn shops that would pay better, and it was also less than an hour north.
Oh, I can prestige
So now that Jerry had dropped her car off, she could drive up there right after class. And so, Barbara just kind of nodded at Jerry and whatever he was saying, and then she took the keys, jumped in her car, and she was off. Over an hour later, Barbara was sitting in her social work class, waiting for the teacher to dismiss them. And as she was sitting there, she began to hear some students whispering behind her. As they did, even though she couldn't quite hear what they were saying, she began to feel her face get red. Because even though she didn't know if they were talking about her, if they were, it certainly would not be the first time. People talked about her a lot. So Barbara just did her best to try to ignore them. And as soon as the teacher said they could go, she jumped up and shoved her books into her bag. And then she hurried out of the building to where her car was parked. She got in and pulled out of the lot. And as she made her way down the street, she actually felt a wave of excitement. She couldn't wait to sell this necklace and finally get out of this place. About 3 hours later, Barbara's best friend Jerry walked up the sidewalk to Barbara's house. He thought they had plans to meet up that afternoon, but Barbara never showed. And Barbara did not usually just blow off plans without calling, so now he was actually at her house just to make sure she was okay. Now, Jerry noticed that her car was not in her driveway. So he just stood there for a minute, wondering if maybe he should go in and ask her roommates where she was. But he ultimately decided against it and just instead headed back to his place. But after beginning the walk back to his place, he passed by an apartment complex down the street from Barbara's place, and he stopped because he could clearly see Barbara's car parked in the lot, which was definitely out of the ordinary, because Jerry was sure she did not know anybody who lived there. And so now, really starting to worry about Barbara, Jerry walked up to the car to check it out, and when he looked inside, he saw there was a note. And so he just opened up her car because he found it was unlocked, and he grabbed the note, and he began to read it. As he did, he felt his heart rate start to go. An hour later, Jerry ran into the campus police station with Barbara's roommates following right behind him. After finding the note inside of Barbara's car, Jerry had gone back to Barbara's house to show it to her roommates and ask if they had seen her, because now he was worried that this note was some kind of suicide note. The note was a goodbye letter that Barbara apparently had written, and it said that she was leaving to be with her people. And the tone of it was just kind of alarming. Now, Jerry could tell her roommates thought that he was overreacting to this note,
I shouldn't have did that.
but they had ultimately agreed to come with him to the police to just make sure everything was okay. And so as soon as the officer on duty came out, Jerry explained to him that he had had plans with Barbara that day and she had not shown up, which was very uncharacteristic. And then he explained how he found her car and then also this letter and his concerns about this letter. And the officer on duty said, okay, we'll look into it. And so over the next few hours, the campus police did look into it. They reached out to some other kids on campus and also to Barbara's family, but nobody had seen or heard from Barbara since that morning. And so the police continued to look into this, realizing this could be a missing persons case, but technically not enough time had passed to officially call it that. So in this first day, it was all just kind of preliminary. The next day, almost 50 miles north of the BYU campus, a worker for a Utah utility company hiked up a trail in Big Cottonwood Canyon, a hilly nature preserve on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. Officially, he was there to check on some water lines. But he was also, taking his time and enjoying himself. This area was beautiful. It was high up in the mountains and very remote and peaceful. So this guy was genuinely shocked when he reached the top of the trail and saw he was not alone. There was a woman up there, But at first, the way his brain processed what he was seeing is he saw this woman who was lying on the ground and she appeared to be nude or partially nude, and he thought, oh, she's sunbathing, like that's what she's doing up here. Then he's like, it's March, it's cold, and she's face down, and she's definitely totally naked. And then he took a few more steps forward, and his brain kind of processed what he was seeing, at which point he just gasped and turned around and ran back to his car to go alert the police. Within the hour, Captain Pete Hayward with the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office drove his cruiser along a remote access road that led to Big Cottonwood Canyon. So Hayward normally loved being in nature. All he really did in his spare time was hunt and fish. But right now, the scenery and remote location were actually kind of an inconvenience because he needed to get to his destination quickly, and that was just very hard to do out here. Hayward had just gotten a call about a woman who'd been found dead in the canyon by a worker for a utility company. And while a few responders were actually already there securing the scene, Hayward knew they wouldn't be able to really do anything until he got there. Because when he worked a murder case, every single detail had to go through him. A few minutes later, Hayward saw some police cars up ahead on the side of the road, and also a deputy waiting by a trailhead. And so he pulled over, got out, and then followed the deputy up a steep trail for about 300 yards. Pretty out of breath by the time he saw a few other crime scene techs and officers gathered around a bush, where underneath the bush there was the body of a woman lying face down. Hayward walked over and crouched down to examine the body, and right away he could see at least 3 bullet wounds in the woman's back. But other than that, he didn't see any other injuries, and there were no clear signs of decomposition. His best guess was that this woman had been there for maybe a day or so. It was actually sort of a miracle when he thought about it. This time of year, nobody came out to this area. And if it hadn't been for that utility worker, I mean, she might not have been found for months. Hayward looked next to the body, and he saw the woman's clothes and shoes were right nearby. Each item was actually folded very neatly, which struck him as a little bit strange. Hayward pulled on a glove and began examining the clothing, and he could see that there was really nothing ripped or damaged. And also, as Hayward kind of walked around the immediate area, he noticed the whole scene was just as neat as the clothes. There was no gun anywhere, and no marks in the dirt or signs of a struggle or a fight, and there was no indication that the body had been dragged around, and so Hayward felt pretty confident that this woman was likely shot and killed in the exact spot she was found in. Hayward stood in the middle of the trail and considered everything he was seeing. The neatly folded clothes could have been removed during consensual sex, and then maybe things turned violent, or they could mean the woman was maybe forced to undress at gunpoint. Either way, Hayward's gut told him that this woman's killer was someone she knew, because the thing was, getting up here from the road was not easy. I mean, Hayward was pushing 50 and knew he was not in the best shape, but even for somebody who was young and fit, it would be hard to force another person all the way up a trail like this. It made more sense that this woman had first walked up willingly with someone she likely trusted, and then that person killed her once they were up there. But Hayward knew, his theory didn't mean much until he figured out who this woman was. She didn't seem to have a purse with her, and there was no ID in the pockets of her folded clothes. So Hayward waved some other officers over to help him flip her body over so they could look underneath her. And when they did that, Hayward saw there were a few bullets gathered in the dirt. They'd clearly gone straight through this woman from the shots in her back. And so Hayward quickly told a tech to go ahead and photograph and bag the bullets for testing, and also to get some of the dirt the bullets had been lodged in case there was some evidence mixed in. So investigators in the 1970s did not rely on DNA. They could test for things like clothing fibers or hairs and eventually connect that material to suspects. And so after giving his team their marching orders, Hayward took a deep breath and then headed back down the trail. He needed to go find this woman's name. The next day, Wednesday, March 13th, Hayward hustled down a hallway towards a meeting room at the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office. He was bleary-eyed and basically running on adrenaline because he'd been working this case non-stop since the day before. And he'd just come from a meeting with the ballistics expert who told him the gun that killed this woman was likely a .357 caliber. Now, this was obviously great for the investigation. However, a .357 was not particularly uncommon, so it didn't really narrow things down a whole bunch. However, Hayward had uncovered something that was major for the investigation, and that was the victim's identity. It was 22-year-old Barbara Rockey. So Hayward's team had put a broadcast out over the news the night before about the discovery of this body. And after they had put that out, they had gotten a call from the BYU police about a student of theirs who had gone missing a day earlier. And just a few hours ago, some of this missing student's classmates had come up to Salt Lake City to identify the body, and they had confirmed it was Barbara. Now, Hayward had spoken to some of those kids already, and he had some other officers contacting Barbara's family. But right now, Hayward was on his way to get a formal statement from a young man named Jerry Hicker. Jerry was one of the people who identified the body, and he was the first person to report Barbara missing. So Hayward was hoping he would have information that would point them towards Barbara's custody. Minutes later, Hayward sat down at a conference table across from Jerry, and from the looks of it, Jerry was very rattled. He kept shaking his head and looking away like he was trying not to cry. Hayward was not a particularly gentle interviewer, so he didn't waste time with condolences or tissues, especially because Jerry was an obvious suspect. He was Barbara's closest friend at school, apparently, and Hayward was sure Barbara was killed by somebody she trusted. So he just bluntly told Jerry that he needed to know every single thing that happened on the day Barbara went missing. Jerry was sort of caught off guard by this level of bluntness, but he took a shaky breath and then explained how he'd borrowed Barbara's car the day before and then dropped it back off at her place on Monday morning around 10 a.m.
Oh my
For a
gosh.
few hours. He then said he was supposed to meet up with Barbara. They had plans for later that day to hang out, but Barbara didn't show up. And when he went to her house to check on her car was gone, and so he began walking back home again when he actually saw her car down the block outside of an apartment complex that he didn't understand she would be at. Like, he didn't think she knew anybody who lived
Oh,
over
this
there.
thing was out
He
here.
said he walked up to the car, looked inside, and saw there was a note. He tried the door handle, it was
Oh
open,
my
he
gosh,
reached
what
inside,
is
got the
bothering
note
my
out, and
face?
read it. He said it was a pretty disturbing note. He thought it was maybe a suicide note. Hayward nodded. He had seen the note. The BYU police had given it to him. It did seem to be from Barbara, telling her roommates she was leaving town to be with people who she fit in with, but the note was kind of vague, and Hayward really wasn't sure what to make of it just yet. You know, it could be a suicide note, or it could be something entirely ordinary. And the truth was, he wasn't actually even sure that Barbara had really written the letter. Maybe her killer had written the letter. Maybe whoever murdered Barbara was attempting to make her disappearance look like a suicide, or maybe imply that she had run away in the hopes that police would
First of all, I was in the air.
So
How can
Hayward
these
had
things
sent the
jump
letter
that
off to a
high?
handwriting expert to see what they thought. Now, Hayward asked Jerry about his relationship with Barbara, and Jerry explained that the two of them hung out a ton, and she gravitated towards him since she felt sort of unwelcome at school and around her roommates who didn't really like her, because she wasn't religious like they were. Jerry also told Hayward that Barbara had made the conflict with her roommates much worse by intentionally saying sacrilegious things in order to freak them out. So he said there was a lot of tension between them, and it had gotten so bad that at one point he had tried to find Barbara another place to live. This made Hayward perk up. I mean, knowing that Barbara had a potential domestic conflict was an interesting lead. Even though a group of young, devout Mormon women were not necessarily obvious murder suspects, it was definitely worth looking into. Maybe one of them had been so horrified and outraged by Barbara's teasing that they'd snapped and tried to hurt her. Hayward didn't have any other questions for Jerry, so he stood up and told him he could go. He wasn't ready to eliminate anybody as a suspect just yet, but so far, Jerry seemed pretty unlikely. He had an alibi, and was also the one who reported Barbara missing. And considering it was complete luck that her body was even found at all in the area that it was, you know, it really would have been in the killer's best interest to keep quiet and hope her body was never found. So why would Jerry go to police at all if he was the killer? So Hayward headed out the door to wrangle some officers. He needed to go to Kobo and have a word with Barbara's roommates. The next afternoon, just 2 days after Barbara was found in the canyon, Hayward pulled up to a pawn shop on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. If he thought he was tired yesterday, well, he was absolutely exhausted now, because a lot had happened in the last 24 hours. They'd gotten in touch with Barbara's family, who were obviously shocked and devastated, but they didn't have any useful information for the investigation. They didn't know much about Barbara's friends or life at school, so they couldn't say if anybody would have wanted to hurt her. And they'd had no idea if she had been planning to leave campus for any reason. But apparently, she was, because the handwriting expert had come back and confirmed the note was authentic, and Barbara did write it. So her plans to leave appeared to be genuine, which is what the note basically was about, if you read it literally. But for Hayward, after speaking to Jerry, who talked about the tension between Barbara and her roommates and how she didn't fit in, and also after Hayward literally spoke to all 7 of Barbara's roommates, and they all actually admitted they did not like Barbara, it made Hayward think that the letter from Barbara should be interpreted literally, that she was just trying to flee campus and get away, in particular from her roommates. But the roommates all had solid alibis for the day Barbara went missing. So for now, Hayward basically had to rule out the roommates. But Hayward was not that upset about this, because the roommates had actually given him another lead. According to one of the roommates, right before Barbara had disappeared, she had mentioned that she planned to pawn a turquoise necklace that she owned in Salt Lake City. So Hayward and some other officers had spent the whole day canvassing pawn shops in that area to see if maybe she had actually gone through with it. Now, so far, Hayward had not found the necklace or found the pawn shop that maybe Barbara went to, but he was very hopeful, maybe too hopeful in some ways. Because, aside from this necklace, the investigation really was kind of losing steam. They had searched and fingerprinted Barbara's car, but had not found anything significant. They'd also gotten an autopsy back, and it was mostly uneventful. The medical examiner had actually counted 5 gunshot wounds, not just 3, so more than Hayward had thought, but they couldn't confirm whether or not Barbara was sexually assaulted. And also, the forensics report had come back, and they had not been able to collect any fingerprints at the scene. And so all of this was swirling around in Hayward's head as he stepped into this particular pawn shop, and he asked the woman behind the counter if they had recently purchased a turquoise necklace. And to his shock, the woman said yes. And then she gestured towards a glass case behind the counter where Hayward could see a long white necklace lined with turquoise stones on a red felt pad. About a half an hour later, Hayward was back behind the wheel of his cruiser. His heart was pounding and his mind was racing so fast he could barely pay attention to the road, because Hayward finally had a real trail here. The shop clerk's description of the person who had sold that turquoise necklace matched Barbara perfectly. Not only that, the shopkeeper also had a receipt for the sale that showed Barbara was at the store on March 11th at 12:50 p.m., the same day she went missing. But the most incredible part of this new lead was that Barbara had apparently told this clerk that she was in a hurry because her boyfriend was circling the block outside. And this was huge because Hayward and his team had spoken to a lot of people in Barbara's life, and no one had mentioned a boyfriend. Now, unfortunately, the pawn shop worker had not gotten a look at this person, this boyfriend that Barbara was talking about. So Hayward had just taken the necklace and the receipt for evidence, and now he was rushing back to the precinct to make some calls. He needed to see if anybody in Barbara's life knew about this boyfriend, and maybe had just failed to mention it for some reason. But as soon as Hayward parked and hurried inside the precinct, he was stopped by a deputy, and this deputy seemed as excited and frazzled as Hayward felt. The deputy told Hayward that he wasn't going to believe this, but they had been continuing their background interviews, and some of Barbara's friends said that Barbara had mentioned a boyfriend named Richard. This was great news for Hayward. I mean, he was literally looking for exactly this information. But this actually was not the reason why the deputy was so worked up, just the fact that she had a boyfriend. He explained that Richard was Richard Finder, a supposed psychic from California who just happened to be in town on a ski vacation at the same time Barbara was killed. And the reason they knew that was because Richard had just called the station completely out of the blue and offered to help. A few hours later, Hayward sat down across an interrogation table from 30-year-old Richard Finder. Richard had on glasses and he had a goatee, and he seemed very confident and also quite eager. But Hayward, he just felt like he was putting on an act. He felt certain that Richard had to be Barbara's killer. After all, it actually was not unusual for murderers to actually insert themselves into the murder investigation. So, see what's going on and maybe deflect blame away from themselves. And so for Hayward, he felt like that was exactly what Richard was doing, calling in to offer up his supposed psychic services. But also, Hayward had spent the last couple of hours digging into Richard, and he also discovered that he owned a .357 pistol, the same kind of gun that had killed Barbara. And on top of that, he found out the place where Richard was staying was in Salt Lake City, very close to Big Cottonwood King, where Barbara's body was found. It was just too many coincidences. And so Hayward was prepared to get extremely tough with Richard to get a confession. But Hayward got a few of his background questions out of the way first. And after asking Richard how he knew Barbara, Richard explained that they had connected after she had heard him speak on the radio. And he said that they'd actually never been physical, but they'd had a deep spiritual relationship. After that, Hayward cut to the chase and just asked Richard point blank why he had called the station. And at that point, Richard became very serious and said that he needed to come forward because he had a feeling about what had happened to Barbara. He said, he was a psychic, and he had a vision that the gun, the murder weapon, had been thrown in some water somewhere. Hayward couldn't believe what he was hearing, because, the police had not announced the murder weapon was missing. Richard shouldn't have known they were looking for the murder weapon. Clearly he did. So at this point, Hayward did not ask more questions about what his vision said. Instead, he demanded that Richard account for every single hour of the day on Monday, March 11th, the day that Barbara went missing. And for the first time, Richard actually seemed genuinely thrown off. He just sort of stared back at Hayward in what seemed to be complete shock. And then he said he didn't kill Barbara. He said he couldn't have. He was with his friends the whole day. Hayward just kind of glared at Richard and then snipped a pad of paper over to him to write down his friend's information so they could follow up. And as he watched Richard hurry to jot down some names and numbers, Hayward felt sure this was their guy. There was just a mountain of circumstantial evidence here against him. But he knew they needed something more concrete to actually make an arrest. So Hayward first would have to check out Richard's alibi, and also test Richard's personal gun, his .357, against the bullets that had killed Barbara. So he told Richard that for now he could go, but they would need to take a look at his gun. A few weeks later, Hayward sat at his desk in the sheriff's office staring at some ballistics results from Richard's gun. And it would turn out it was definitely not the gun that killed Barbara. And Hayward literally couldn't remember a time when he'd been more, frankly, shocked and disappointed. I mean, he really had Richard pegged as the killer. Richard basically was his only suspect, and he was a great one, especially since they had checked on his alibi and it didn't really hold up. The friends he said he was with that whole day actually said, well, we were with him, but not the whole day. So basically, there were large chunks of time on the day she went missing when Richard was unaccounted for. Hayward sighed and reminded himself that, just because the gun he owned wasn't a match, it didn't mean Richard was innocent. I mean, it's possible he used a different .357 and then just ditched the weapon. Still, though, Hayward couldn't believe they were back to square one like this. He felt like he had done everything he could at this point. He talked to who he needed to talk to. He'd analyzed the evidence they'd gotten, and he had really nothing to show for it. Hayward was used to closing cases and giving families the answers they wanted. And he was worried he wasn't going to be able to do that. And sure enough, over the coming months and then years, Hayward did continue to investigate his case. But the leads got fewer and fewer, and eventually he got promoted, and then before long...
Mr. Ghost, you're supposed to be protecting me, bro.
Eventually Barbara's case just went cold. In the fall of 2005, so over 25 years after Barbara's murder, Detective Todd Park sat on the floor by his desk in the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Department. Around him on the floor, it was covered with crime scene photos and interviews and evidence logs from the 1974 investigation of Barbara Rocky's murder. Park was a brand new homicide detective, and he had taken on this case after getting a call from one of Barbara's sisters, begging the sheriff's office to reopen it. And Park wasn't sure if it was maybe just new guy enthusiasm, but he was already pretty obsessed with trying to solve it. He really wanted to find some answers for the Rocky family, since they'd been wondering what happened to Barbara for now over 2 decades. And Park actually felt pretty optimistic about it, because even though during the original investigation, they hadn't
hate
relied
his
on
own
DNA
guy.
testing. They couldn't really even do DNA testing. Despite that, the investigators at the time had
shit.
done a rape kit and saved all the evidence from the scene, like Barbara's clothes and even the dirt that was underneath her body, which meant that with the current advancements in DNA technology, there was a good chance they could actually solve this thing. Park had already sent a few items over for testing, but while we waited for the results, he was going over the details of the case to get a sense of how it was investigated back in 1974. We found it was a pretty unusual case. The murder had initially been investigated as a personally motivated crime. But while the case was cold, police had also begun to consider the idea that maybe Barbara had been murdered by the notorious serial killer, Ted Bundy. This was not personal, but she was just one of many victims. Ted Bundy had been arrested less than an hour away from where Barbara lived in Salt Lake City in 1975, just 1 year after her murder. And he had been killing college women all over the West Coast,
Oh, that's facts.
including
Ted Bundy
several
was
in
out there
Utah,
wildin'.
the same year Barbara was killed. But investigators in the late 1970s had ruled Ted Bundy out after determining he'd been committing a different murder in Washington state at the same time Barbara was killed, so he could not have been her killer. But it was still possible that Barbara had been killed by a different serial killer in the area. 1974 is notoriously known as the Year of Fear because there were so many killers operating in the United
Oh my
States at that
gosh.
time. But as Park read through the notes, he found himself agreeing with the original investigators' first instincts, that Barbara's murder must have been personal. Also, just the amount of times Barbara was shot seemed emotionally charged. And so Park believed Barbara's boyfriend, Richard Binder, had to be the killer. I mean, after all, Richard had been in the area at the time of the murder. He basically had no alibi. And, he brought up the fact that there was a missing murder weapon when the public didn't even know that. So he knows things about the crime scene that he shouldn't know. But Park felt like there were some other people in this case that also deserved a second look, like Barbara's best friend, Jerry Hickel. It was true he did have an alibi, and Barbara had told that pawn shop owner before she was killed that she was with her boyfriend, which she would not have referred to Jerry as. But if this was as emotional a crime as Park thought it was, Jerry had to be considered. After all, he was Barbara's closest friend at school, and maybe he heard she was leaving town and got mad at her. And then Barbara's roommates, they all seemed to have solid alibis, but maybe one of them had gotten somebody else to kill them. And Park knew the original investigators hadn't found
I'm just
any
gonna
evidence
spray
of
him
that,
first.
but they also hadn't seemed to spend much time with roommates one way or another, so just kind of quickly ruled them out. But Park also knew it could be someone that they hadn't even considered yet, like the utility worker who actually found the body, or maybe another student at BYU who didn't like Barbara and considered her an outsider or a weirdo. Park wasn't
Didn't
sure
think
yet,
it was
but he
fine
was
for the
confident
moment.
that they'd be able to pick up some DNA somewhere in the evidence. Once they did, they'd find their killer.
I keep going the wrong direction now.
2 years later, on an afternoon in October of 2007, Park paced around his office and periodically stopped to put the phone on his desk, waiting for a call from the lab. And with each passing moment, he got more and more anxious. So at this point in Park's re-investigation of Barbara's murder, the DNA testing had basically gotten nowhere. Over the last 2 years, the medical lab had gone over almost every single item from Barbara's case, like her rape kit swabs and her clothes. But they hadn't been able to get any DNA from anything. It either wasn't there or was just too old and not preserved well enough. And so the only thing left to test was the dirt that the original investigators collected from underneath Barbara's body. Park actually had not originally sent in the dirt because he didn't think it would have any DNA inside of it. But it was now the only piece of evidence that he had left. So Park knew that when the lab called this time, he'd either be on his way to finding the killer's name, or his case would basically be over. But then, Park's phone finally rang. He immediately picked it up, and his mouth went dry when he heard it was the lab on the other end. And before Park could even ask them, they told him they had a profile. They'd been able to find traces of DNA in that dirt sample taken from under Barbara's body. And when Park finally got his hands on that DNA profile and he ran it through their criminal database, he got a name. Based on DNA evidence and a decades-long investigation, Here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Barbara Rocky on March 11, 1970.
Oh shit. There isn't. Oh no, I'm tweaking. Oh, I'm tweaking.
Just before noon, the killer watched Barbara.
I'm tweaking. I thought there was more than two of us in here. And I was running next to the homie.
Inside, smiled at Barbara. She smiled right back. Together,
Nope.
they drove to the pawn shop in Salt Lake City that Barbara wanted to go to.
Oh my gosh, I'm
When they
tweaking.
got there, Barbara hopped out of the car.
Alright, let
and
me
went
go help
inside.
home.
Once she was inside, the killer moved over to the driver's seat. So they basically were going to drive the car from that point forward. And as the killer sat in the driver's seat waiting for Barbara, their heart was racing. They couldn't wait for her to get back outside and get in the car because the killer was in love with her. And they had decided that today they were finally going to make their relationship physical. So when Barbara came outside and hopped in the passenger seat of the car and discovered the necklace, the killer very excitedly turned to her and said, "Hey, there's some trails nearby. Why don't we go for a hike?" Barbara clearly hesitated, like she didn't really want to do this. But the killer knew Barbara was knew she had written a goodbye note and was selling the necklace for fun just to leave for good. So he kind of guilt-tripped her. He said, "Look, let's go enjoy the beautiful countryside before you leave town." Barbara shrugged and said, "Okay."
Oh, I'm
So the killer
bugging.
very excitedly drove the car over to the canyon and parked near a picnic area. Then the two of them got out, and as they began walking through the trail, the killer reached down and touched the outside of their pocket, just to make sure the gun that they had stolen from Barbara was still there. Now, they didn't know if they were going to use the gun or not, but they just wanted to make sure it was there and ready. And so for a while, the killer and Barbara just hiked along this trail, just chatting and making their way up and enjoying the scenery.
Pack a punch 3.
At some point, the killer just couldn't wait any longer. They had to make their move. And so they stopped Barbara.
It's the earliest I've
And the
gotten
killer,
back up
after
on
making
stream.
sure nobody else was around, they moved forward and kind of made their move. They touched Barbara in a way that was very clearly meant to be romantic. But immediately, Barbara kind of recoiled and jumped back and told the killer that she didn't want that, which immediately made the killer incredibly angry. And so the killer stepped towards her again and could see Barbara had this alarmed look on her face, which made them even more angry. So they pulled out Barbara's gun and they aimed it at her and then told her to take off her clothes. And Barbara, she was
What a this
horrified, but
motherfucker.
she did as she was told, but she intentionally was taking her time. As she took off a piece of clothing, she would painstakingly fold it very neatly, all the while begging the killer not to do this. And then after taking off all of her clothes and stacking them next to her, she continued to plead with the killer. But the killer was so humiliated and so angry that they decided enough was enough. And they shot Barbara right in the chest. And she crumpled to the ground, and they fired wildly several more times until Barbara went still. And then once Barbara was either dead or dying on the ground, the killer just panicked and turned and ran back down the trail, back to Barbara's car. They hopped in and they drove back to Provo and BYU campus. But on the way there, they stopped and ditched Barbara's purse. And then when they actually got to Provo, the reason they parked Barbara's car down the road near that other apartment complex was so that when the killer got out of the car, Barbara's 7 roommates would not see them doing so. Then they fled, leaving Barbara's note in the car. Barbara's note was not a suicide note. It was a literal goodbye
A subscription from Sarah_Ben, 39.
note. Sort of
That's
Thank
like
you for
finding
this
a dollar in your couch.
here.
Thanks a million. Zara_Ben, 39. You're the true MVP, most valuable patron.
Thank you so much for the sub.
He would send the police in a direction.
Ooh, that was dangerous. I was about to get gone.
Turnout, Barbara's killer was her best friend, Jerry Hicker.
Oh shit.
The original investigators didn't suspect Jerry at first, mainly because of his cooperation.
Thank
and since he was
you
the
for
one
the
who also
gifted
first
sub.
reported her missing. But they did
How have you
begin to
been?
get suspicious of him when he eventually revealed his violent streak. The year after he killed Barbara, he was connected to a few different rape cases on the campus. But they didn't have enough evidence to make
shit.
an arrest until decades later when the lab finally found
Fuck yeah,
DNA
listen to
in
Sticky.
soil from the 1974 crime scene. They were able to match that profile with Jerry's
You can't
DNA,
stop me.
which they had on file from his involvement in another unrelated crime.
Oh, you might
And
be able to
ultimately,
stop me.
Jerry killed Barbara with
Oh,
her own
no.
gun, which he had helped
Oh,
her buy
no.
so she could protect herself from killers just like him. By the time Jerry was arrested in 2007, he was dying of cancer. He confessed to Barbara's murder for a reduced sentence and served 5 years before he was released. He died in 2014.
Just call it limo like the rest of us.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now.
And
So
that's what
click
we're
here
doing, guys.
and
We
give
are
them a watch.
binging true crime while
All right,
I
until
play the
next time.
game.
See ya.
And then I'm gonna get on Warzone in a little while. Where is my aim that I don't have today? What the hell? Damn, they getting yoked up into the... Damn! Not y'all getting yanked into the hole like this. Oh my gosh.
Today's stories are about how sometimes doing what you think is the right thing is actually the most dangerous choice.
They just got yoked up. Did I?
You can make. But
Oh.
before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan
Oh, don't tell me I'm lagging now. Don't do that.
of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format,
No, why is it lagging all of a sudden?
come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time you're walking into a building and the like button's right behind you, obviously following you, make sure to turn around, make eye contact, and then shut the door. Don't hold it long. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories.
Oh no.
On a Saturday afternoon in February of 2011, 18-year-old
Go attack my minions!
was 1,000 feet underground, crouched inside a dark cave in Lafayette, Georgia, along with 4 of his friends. As Michael looked around, his headlamp bounced off all the low-hanging rocks and underground waterfalls, and deep crevices. It all just kind of felt like some kind of dark and otherworldly planet down there. So this cave that they were in was a famous cave.
Attack my minions! Oh, they all dead now.
Friends
Damn.
driven over 400 miles from the college town in Gainesville to see it. Ellison was almost 12 miles of tunnels and shafts and crevices, and thousands of cavers went through it every year. It was very popular. Now, to be clear, caving as an activity was not really Michael's thing. He was a marketing major at the University of Florida, and he mostly considered himself to be a pretty quiet person and liked studying or playing in his school band or volunteering with his church youth group. And so crawling through a tiny, pitch-black, very claustrophobic hole hundreds of feet underground was not really his first choice for fun. But Michael was not there today for fun. He was there because his close friend, a guy named Grant Lockenbach, had suggested it. So he had said, okay, I'll go with you. Just now, Michael looked over to where Grant was sitting with his girlfriend, whose name was Carrie, and also they were sitting with 2 of their other friends. And the group of them were all looking for their backpacks, sort of taking stock of the various pieces of gear that they had brought along with them. Now, they'd only entered Ellison a few minutes ago, but already the group had stopped because there was something in this area that Grant really wanted to see. And when Grant wanted to do something, it usually happened. Hence why
come on.
Michael capitulated and wound up in this cave, because Grant wanted him to. And so,
Come on, come on,
like
come on.
normal, he went along with it.
Ooh, let's go.
So Grant, he was the president of their school's Fellowship of
Ooh,
Christian Athletes,
ooh.
which Michael, Carrie, and the other friends were also
Let's go.
members.
Let's go.
And when Michael had joined the fellowship,
Hey.
Grant had sort of taken him under his wing.
I'm gonna make it
told
past
Michael
level
that he
50
had
today.
tons of potential. In fact, he said Michael had enough potential to be the next president of the fellowship. And this had given Michael a ton of confidence. Because he really looked up to Grant. I mean, a lot of people...
Why you bring all these zombies to me?
Cool. He was a few years older than Michael and was basically like a 6-foot-tall ball of positive energy. He was always looking for some adventure to go off and do. Grant had been exploring caves as a hobby for the last 3 years. He was actually really the only member of their group with any real caving experience. And it was actually this lack of experience amongst the other people that were with Grant, including Michael, that was the reason they were going through an easier tunnel within Ellison that was basically a straight shot through the mountain and did not require much gear like rope or climbing equipment. It was like very beginner. But despite that, despite the low level of difficulty of the caving route they had chosen,
And he's still
they
over
brought
there
that stuff
getting
anyway,
attacked.
all that extra equipment, because along this easier route, at the place where they were now stopped, was the entrance to a vertical shaft that Grant specifically wanted to climb down, even if he went alone. This shaft was
I'm gonna prestige
125
max all
feet
these
deep.
guns today.
So think of like a 10-story building. That is how deep this pit went. But it was actually called the warm-up pit because compared to the other, deep pits in Ellison, it was nothing. Some were way deeper, like over 500 feet. So this was definitely not beginner. This was an advanced thing to be doing, so Grant was going to do it. But again, it's sort of a novice level, more advanced thing to be doing in this cave. Now, Michael watched Grant take the backpack with all the equipment in it over to this pit's entrance, which was basically just a very large hole in the ground that was over near this waterfall. It was only about a few feet away from Michael. And so Michael walked over to Grant to help set him up, which involved attaching a climbing rope to the rocks that Grant could then use to lower himself into this pit with. This process is called rigging, and it took them a while since really Michael had to wait for Grant to instruct him.
I don't know
on
what I
every
thought I
step,
was getting
because
ready to
Michael,
do.
Again, is not an experienced caver at all. But as Michael worked with Grant to get him all rigged up, he found himself peering into the pitch black hole.
Come
And
on,
as he
Brody,
looked
get.
down into what just felt like this bottomless abyss, he felt his stomach kind of flip. He was glad he had not promised Grant that he would go down too, because seeing it now up close in person, this was terrifying. He did not want to go into this thing. Grant clearly did. He was excited. And so Michael and Grant continued to get Grant all set up.
I need
and then
ammo. Where
eventually,
is it?
finally, when Grant was rigged, Michael heard the sound of something pretty heavy sliding off of a rock. And then moments later, there was this loud, echoing
Oh my
thud
God, I don't know what I
from
just
deep
did.
inside of this hole.
Or
the
why I
warm-up
thought that
pit.
was a good
For a
idea.
moment, Michael was just confused. He didn't know what the sound was. Maybe it was a rock falling into the pit. But he looked over at Grant, and Grant had a very unhappy expression, and he was looking at the ground right next to the pit hole, and that was where their backpack had been, with all the equipment inside of it, at least the equipment that they weren't using, and the backpack was not there anymore. The backpack had just fallen 125 feet down into this pit. Now, obviously, this was not good. They did not want their backpack in this hole, but it was actually worse than just losing their equipment potentially, because in that bag was
Oh, he
their
coming to
own
get me! Yo,
self-
this is the realest
property.
teammate I've ever had.
Also where they'd put all their ropes and other climbing gear. They'd taken some stuff
Oh.
out, to get Grant rigged up here, but still, losing this bag felt really bad. Without its contents, they could easily get stranded or trapped inside this cave, and they wouldn't be able to call or text anybody. They'd be stuck. And so Michael could actually feel himself
Just
starting
run!
to panic.
Run!
And then Grant cut in and played it cool as always, and he said, look, it's no big deal. He would just go down there and he would get it. I mean, he was going into the hole anyway, and he was rigged up after all, so he would just go down and retrieve the bag. It would be fine. And then before Michael or, Grant's girlfriend or the other friends could say anything, Grant just, strapped on his harness and a pair of ascenders, which were climbing tools that would help him move down the rope in a controlled way, and he began sort of positioning himself to go down into this pit. And Michael just watched Grant in complete awe. I mean, Grant was so confident that he was able to basically make everybody else around him feel calm too. And I mean, Michael felt himself calming down just watching Grant. And this was not the only time that Grant had projected calm in the face of danger. During Grant's freshman year, he'd casually climbed up the exterior of one of their school's dormitories just to see if he could do it. And he did do it. And he also had joined the school's ROTC, which is a military reserve training program, and learned how to jump out of planes. So he had skydived. It was sort of a thrill-seeking activity. And so this moment in the cave
That was
seemed
dumb.
like yet another
That was
example
so dumb, and
of
I didn't
why
even get what I
Grant was
wanted. I
really
needed
such an
Jug.
incredible leader. And
Am I
Michael found
limping,
himself
or is this gun
hoping
just
that
super
by the
heavy?
time
Oh,
he
shit.
potentially took over as president of the Fellowship, that he could be just as fearless as Grant.
Oh
But for
my
now,
gosh,
Michael
alright.
watched as Grant very calmly lowered himself into the hole and then disappeared into the abyss below. And for the next few minutes, it was very quiet. All Michael could hear was the sound of the waterfall. So he and Carrie and the others just sort of talked amongst themselves and waited for Grant to call back up that he was down there and had successfully grabbed the backpack. And finally, they did hear Grant, and he did call out from somewhere down in the hole. Michael couldn't really understand what Grant was saying because the waterfall that was kind of blasting nearby was really loud, and also Grant's voice echoed around the cave, which made it hard to tell what he was saying. So at this point, Michael and Carrie and the others were not worried. They figured that this was just an acoustics problem, not a safety problem. So Michael just walked over to the edge of this pit
Why
and
didn't he
leaned
let the
over
bomb blow
and just
up?
looked down. But he couldn't see Grant. He was too far down and it was too dark. And so Michael called out, asking Grant to repeat himself because they couldn't understand what he was saying. And Grant did yell back. He clearly replied to Michael, but Michael still couldn't really make out what he was saying. However, this time, there was something really different about the way Grant sounded. Again, even though he doesn't know what Grant's saying, one thing was definitely clear. Grant no longer sounded like the calm, cool, and collected, fearless leader that he normally was. He was talking really fast, he was repeating himself, he was saying something really, really quickly, very urgently. And even though, again, it wasn't clear what it was, the tone was very clear. Grant was scared. There was a problem. Now, obviously, problems arise when you are rappelling into a 125-foot hole underground in this cave. That, problems can happen. But for Michael and the others, when they sort of realized that something was wrong for Grant, it was really shocking. I mean, Grant is the guy that got other people out of problems. He was the calm guy. Nothing rattled him. And so just to hear him basically panicking, it was really unsettling for those at the surface. And so Michael and the others, they're kind of hit with this sudden realization that, one, it's very unsettling to hear Grant sounding this way, but worse, two, is they're not cavers. They can't go into this pit and save Grant if he needs saving. Not only because they lacked experience, but also all the caving, all the climbing equipment was in that backpack that fell into the pit that's down there with Grant. So there's no way they can realistically help him if he is in any sort of trouble down there. And also, their one cell phone is down in that backpack in the pit. And so unless Grant can figure out whatever problem he's got and get back up here on his own, Michael and the others, without even saying it, knew like they were kind of helpless. And so as this realization is setting in for Michael and the others, Grant goes from trying to talk to them, even though, again, they can't tell what he's saying, he just sounds sort of panicked, just straight up screaming. He's screaming for them. Something is horribly wrong. And so Michael and Carrie, they start yelling down to Grant, trying to get him to clarify what's going on, but you have this waterfall that's causing all this noise and splashing everywhere. It's dark, and Grant clearly is so panicked that he's not even listening to them, and so it's chaos, it's madness. And so Michael and Carrie, they turn to the other two friends, and they say, look, we're gonna stay here at this hole and wait for Grant. You two leave the cave, go get help. And so the other two, they rushed off to do just that. While Michael and Carrie just sat there listening to Grant getting more and more hysterical by the second, somewhere down in this hole. They still have no idea what's wrong, but clearly there is an emergency here. So for a little while, after the friends have gone off, Michael and Carrie, even though they're not really talking to Grant, as he's just kind of rambling and yelling and screaming, they can't understand him, they're just kind of shouting down into the hole that everything's going to be okay, we've sent to get help, it's going to be okay, you're going to get out of here soon. They have no idea if he can hear them or understand them. They're assuming that the acoustics are bad down there too. Again, the sound of that waterfall is so loud, it's so dark. And so they're just like having this awful moment. But then what cut through all this chaos was at some point, Michael heard Grant say something that he really did
Oh my
understand.
God, there's still a horde?
At some point, in a very high-pitched, almost screaming voice, yelled out Michael's name. Like he was directly yelling to Michael, like, I need you, Michael, to help me. Now, at this point, obviously the situation has escalated dramatically and already, like, things are bad. And for Michael, this felt like a big deal. I mean, before that, all the yelling and screaming was obviously bad, but Michael, he kind of views himself as, Grant's successor, potentially. He's going to be the next, president of this fellowship, and he looked up to Grant so much, primarily because Grant was like this fearless leader. And so Michael sort of felt like when he heard his name called out, that Grant was specifically sort of challenging him, like, you, Michael, I need you. Michael took on that responsibility. And he felt like, I can't just sit here. I can't just wait. Something needs to be done, and I need to do it. I need to save Grant. And so Michael, he jumped up and he grabbed the extra harness they still had, and he put it on. And as he was doing that, he could hear Carrie, who, she's seeing what's happening. And she's telling him, don't do it. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to go down this thing. Like, this is dangerous. Or what are you doing? Don't go. And Michael, he just looked at her and he said, I have to do this. I know Grant would do this for me. I'm doing it for him. He needs me. I'm going to do it. Michael, he's listening to Carrie, still trying to tell him not to go, but he just said to her, please pray for me. And then he walked over and he attached his harness to the same rope that Grant presumably was still attached to down at the bottom, but stuck for some reason.
Oh my God! I was going to say, did I not get the
As soon
armor?
as Michael disappeared into this hole, Carrie knelt down beside the pit, she put her hands together, and she prayed as hard as she could. Michael would be okay. And after a few minutes, she heard Michael call out from somewhere in the hole. And for some reason, she could actually understand what Michael was saying, which was basically that he and Grant were okay. He was with Grant, but they were just very, very cold. Relief flooded over Carrie, and as she exhaled all the tension she was holding in, and as the adrenaline kind of began to leave her body, because now she's thinking everything's okay, she also realized that she too was very cold. She just hadn't been thinking about it. She was so fixated on the safety of her boyfriend and also Michael. After all, she was only wearing a t-shirt, and the cave was very damp, and there's this waterfall kind of spraying water everywhere. It was cold. It was a damp environment. And so she's, her teeth are chattering too. She's cold. And so Carrie naturally yelled down into this hole. She can't see them, of course. She's just yelling into the darkness, what's going on? What's wrong? Is Grant okay? But Michael just shouted back to her, I'm fine, but didn't answer her question about Grant. And at this, Carrie could tell clearly there's something really wrong down there, and it probably has to do with Grant. And so she stood up, she began pacing back and forth in her stomach, some knots, and she's periodically yelling down into the hole to Michael, like, what's going on? Is Grant okay? Are you okay? But Michael, all he would say back to her is, I'm fine. He would just say that back to her. But his response time began to slow down. He wasn't responding to each and every one of her calls. He would just, yell out, I'm fine. But it began to become more and more spaced out as Carrie began to ramp up her questioning, asking more and more, what's going on? Until finally, Michael just stopped answering altogether. There were no more voices coming out of the hole. And so the minutes ticked by, and Carrie, she continued to pace around, yelling out to Michael and Grant, but the only reply she got was the sound of the water from the waterfall lapping up against the cave walls. About an hour and a half later, just before 4 p.m., a man named Anmar Mirza, along with 2 other men, ran into the Ellison Cave with a bag of climbing equipment and medical supplies. Now, there was a bigger team of rescue workers on their way up the mountain behind them, gear and help personnel, but that proved to move slowly, because every time they respond to a cave accident. Because typically, there were a lot of people and a lot of equipment, specialized equipment that was required, and also usually the victims were trapped in, pretty remote and difficult to access places, like tunnels and shafts deep inside of these caves. So Anmar and his team grew the initial smaller group that went ahead of the larger one to just kind of get the rescue started. A few minutes after entering the cave, Anmar saw a headlamp beam up ahead in the darkness, kind of bobbing around.
Ooh.
And as soon as he reached the origin of this light, he found a young woman who was sitting by a large hole, and she was shaking and terrified. She explained that her name was Carrie, and that her boyfriend, whose name was Grant, along with one of his friends, whose name was Michael, were down in this hole. And that Grant had gone in, there had been some issue, Michael had gone in after him, and now, when she called out for them, neither of them were responding. After hearing this, Anmar directed one of his team members to take Carrie and bring her out of the cave. And then once they had left, Anmar put on his climbing gear, and as soon as he was ready, he began to rappel down into this pit. As Anmar rappelled, he's looking straight down into this dark shaft, and at first he can't see anything. But after a little while, he began to see somewhere down below were what appeared to be 2 lights towards the bottom of this pit. which he assumed belonged to the two men. But before he could actually reach them, he felt something wet and freezing cold slap his cheek. Then he saw something emerge from the darkness right below him. It would turn out, when Grant rappelled down into this warm-up pit, he had made a terrible, terrible mistake. He had attached his rig to a section of rock that was directly in the path of a freezing cold waterfall. Now, this alone could have been okay. You can rappel effectively through a waterfall if you're careful. Except what happened with Grant is, as he was rappelling literally through the water, like the water is coming off this waterfall, it's hitting him, he got stuck. His rope got tangled. And where he got stuck was literally in the path of the waterfall. So he's stuck in the cave, he can't go up, he can't go down, and he's just getting pounded by freezing cold water. Now, at first, what Grant likely did is kind of flail around to try to get out of the path of this water, but there was nowhere to go. He's in this shaft, there's nowhere to go, and he's just dangling there, and he began trying to scream out for help, but that was why his words were muffled, because the water was hitting him in the face, so he couldn't speak clearly. And then also, as he's just dangling there, very quickly, having that icy water hitting him nonstop would have actually sent his body into shock. And it's like he wouldn't have been able to speak or think anymore. I mean, he was becoming hypothermic. And then, in what was possibly one of his final moments of clarity, he managed to yell out Michael's name. He said it really clearly, kind of managed to get his face out of the water for a second. And Michael, who trusted Grant completely when he heard his name being called, it felt like it was his calling. He needed to go in there and save Grant himself. And so into the hole he went, and he hooked his rope up into the same exact spot that Grant had, and down he went. And Michael, he did an incredibly brave thing by doing this. And it was something that Grant very likely would have done for him too. But again, Michael really had no idea what he was doing. He was basically just going in blind. However, unfortunately, because he just kind of followed Grant's lead and went down there without a plan, well, in the darkness, as he went down, he eventually reached where Grant was, but got stuck as well, also in the path of the water. Granted, he was not nearly as exposed to the water as Grant was, that his face was not getting blasted by water, so he was able to call out and be heard by Carrie, but he also got tangled at the same spot, couldn't move, his body's getting hit by this icy water, and so even though the rescuers did eventually get down to Michael and Grant, by the time they did, it was too late. The two men had froze to death. They basically dangled inside of this hole, getting hit by this water for about 2 hours until their bodies just shut down. In 2013, 2 years after both Michael and Grant died inside of that cave, the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission gave Michael a posthumous medal for risking his life to save Grant's.
Why am I stuck going?
On a Friday night in late March of 1980, an 83-year-old man named Harry R. Truman sat on his couch in his Washington State Lodge with whiskey and coke and turned on his battery-operated radio to listen to the news. And just a second or two later, he found himself having to jack up the volume of the radio because he couldn't hear it anymore because a couple of his cats in the other room were fighting and yowling and was causing whole commotion. Harry had lost track of how many cats he actually had.
I got the new Pack-a-Punch 2 camera, yes!
And even though at this moment he yelled and cursed at them, told them to knock it off, he was actually glad they were out there with him, because he liked them. 5 years earlier, Harry's wife, Edna, had died, and since then he had lived alone, minus his cats. And he also didn't have a lot of neighbors either, so for the most part, he had been fairly isolated the last few years. Also, Spirit Lake, the lake that his lodge was on, was 4 hours south of the major city of Seattle, and pretty far into the wilderness. The lake did get busy in the summer with tourists, but at this time in March, there were only about 60 people that lived there, and they were very spread out. But Harry didn't really mind the solitude. He missed Edna a lot, but he had his cats, and he had his radio, and the jaw-dropping mountain scenery and lake, and he had his whiskey and cokes. So overall, even though he was sort of a gruff guy, he was actually quite happy with his life. But just then, there was a loud knock on Harry's door. And Harry was not surprised by this. I mean, yes, he was way out in the middle of nowhere and he did not expect visitors, but in this case, he knew who it was. And as soon as he thought about that, his face contorted into a scowl. He was really angry. At this point in Harry's life, he really had only one problem, and it was a major problem, at least to him, and that was the government. And for the last few days, government agents, like almost certainly the ones that were knocking on his door, had been harassing him, trying to get him to leave his lodge in the wilderness that he loved so much, because they needed to conduct some kind of federal operation and they wanted everybody to clear out. Now, Harry loved his country, and he'd even fought for it during the First World War, but he really did not like authority, and he could not tolerate being told what to do. During Prohibition, for example, with the period of time in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal.
My bad.
Harry
Oh
had simply
no.
ignored the law and made his own
Oh,
rules.
he a real one for that.
So, over these last few days that these federal agents had come to his
You
house
are the
trying to get
realest,
him to
big
leave,
dog.
Harry had not been intimidated. He had simply stood his ground. He figured it was really only a matter of time before the federal government sent a local police officer over in hopes that Harry would be more cooperative with somebody that he likely already knew. But what they didn't know about Harry is that Harry really didn't cooperate with anyone. Not with the government, certainly, not with local police, not with his own family, not with his friends, or not with the two ex-wives he'd been with before finding Edna. He was just somebody who marched to the beat of his own drum. So now, Harry did not get up to answer the knock on his door. Instead, he just waited until the person out there, the visitor, yelled through the door and announced who they were.
Go ahead,
and
Brody.
not really to Harry's surprise, it was the local deputy that Harry did know, clearly being sent here by the federal agents to try to get Harry to leave. And when Harry still didn't answer the door when the deputy clearly had announced themselves, knowing Harry would know who they were, when Harry still didn't get up, didn't answer the door, the deputy finally, just sort of frustrated, called out, "Harry, are you sure you don't want to go?" Now, even though this deputy was being a whole lot more amicable than the government agents had been, they had been really forceful, basically telling him you gotta leave, the deputy here was at least kind of giving Harry a chance to make a decision. Despite that, the question the deputy had asked just made Harry really mad, because leaving his house was just not something he would ever consider doing. Harry had lived in this lodge for 54 years, and 37 of those years were spent running this lodge as an inn, as a business, with his late wife Edna, who was the love of his life. Now, he'd let the lodge go a little after she had died, so truthfully it was kind of falling apart and it smelled terrible, because of all the cats, but it had been theirs, and now it was his, and he would never give it up. And not only that, but just outside his doorstep was Spirit Lake, which Harry believed was the most beautiful, perfect place in the entire world. It was quiet and serene and situated right at the base of some of the most breathtaking mountains he had ever seen in his whole life. And so to say Harry loved it here was a complete understatement. His lodge and Spirit Lake were basically his whole identity. Harry didn't know if he believed in God, but he did believe in the trees and the lake and the birds that screeched at him at all hours of the day. It was like his home, this area, was his religion. He certainly was not about to give it up just because some federal authority or government agent or whoever told him to. So all Harry said to the deputy waiting outside was a very firm "good night," which Harry was actually quite proud of himself for because he had a really hard time not swearing. So this seemed pretty mild. After that, Harry waited to see if the deputy would challenge him or say anything else, but he didn't. And moments later, Harry heard the deputy's footsteps crunching down the gravel driveway and heading back towards his cruiser. After that, Harry leaned back into his couch and smiled to himself and picked up his drink, kind of toasting himself for standing his ground, and at the same time sort of hoping that maybe now, finally, officials would understand that he was not going to change his mind. But that's not what happened. A little more than a week later, on the morning of April 5th, Harry sat in a folding chair in the clearing by his house, with his binoculars pressed to his eyes, a glass of whiskey coupled with his chair. This was an area of the woods near his house he called his cocktail area, where he'd often go to relax with a drink. It was covered by a thick canopy of evergreens, but it also had a great view of the mountains and the lake. But Harry was not here to relax. He was actually on very high alert, because the woods were absolutely crawling with federal agents and local law enforcement officers. Harry could literally see them right now through his binoculars, walking around the various camps they had set up all over the mountainside.
That dog ain't really doing shit.
And there was nobody to stop them, because everybody else who lived in this forest had bowed to the pressure and left when told to, which meant Harry was quite literally the last resident still fighting the good fight. Now, so far, officials had not physically attempted to force him. Now that Harry saw them assembling all over the mountainside, he had to wonder how long he had before they did try. But at the same time, he also knew that he had one piece of very important and very surprising leverage over the authorities. And that was that over the past couple of days, Harry's refusal to leave his wilderness home just because the government told him to had turned him into a media attraction. Reporters had heard about what was going on and they'd started coming to his house. Now, usually, Harry just did not like the press. Even though he clearly listened to the news himself, he still thought of the press, thought of the media like they were vultures, always looking for dead meat and chaos. But Harry also really liked to talk. He had a lot of very strong opinions. Now, seeing his beautiful lake inundated by outsiders, Harry realized he had to take full advantage of this media interest in him if he wanted to stay in his home.
34,
because the way he
let's
saw it was the
go.
government could really not make him do anything against his will if the whole world was watching. So over the next month, Harry gave a lot of interviews. And pretty quickly, he became kind of an international celebrity. He was this single older man standing up to something way bigger and way more powerful, which was sort of admirable, although people didn't really understand it, but it was still a big story. It was very interesting. But more than that, it seemed like the public just sort of liked Harry. In his interviews, Harry would swear and yell and rant and rave and tell reporters about how no authority figure would dare try to get him out of his house.
Why is it still shut? Oh my God.
And he'd also talk about his life, just telling these crazy stories that had nothing to do with the wilderness, like about the whiskey that he'd bottled and distilled during his Prohibition days, which he called Panther Pea, and about his relationship with his late wife and how they used to dance together at the edge of the lake, or his war stories from World War I. I mean, this guy was just really quite fascinating. And so by the time May rolled around that year, Harry went from being bombarded by the government to being bombarded by the media. Today, this would be like going crazy viral, where everybody's seeing you on their feed. But this is 1980, and so people got their news from newspapers and the television and the radio. But those mediums were all full of Harry, and people were kind of obsessed. Everybody, from average citizens to school kids, sent Harry fan mail, and reporters and news crews came to Harry's in droves, and some even took helicopters just to get there more quickly. And Harry, if he was being honest, sort of relished all the attention. A few months earlier, he'd been happy with his quiet life, no phone, and just had his 1,000 cats for company. But now, just like the whole world cared about him, it was pretty cool. A few weeks later, though, everything changed. On Sunday, May 18th, the sun came up on Harry's lodge, and the woods around it were totally quiet for the first time in weeks. Because Harry, in some ways, had won. He had kept his word, and he'd stayed strong and refused to give in to the government's demands to leave. And finally, the government had backed down. And the sheriff had even come by the day before to tell Harry that, okay, no one's going to come by and ask you to leave anything. It's on you. So now, on May 18th, Harry was getting up. It was just him, the lake, the trees, the big, beautiful mountains. Then, at 8:32 a.m. that morning, a deafening boom shook the earth. It would turn out the media was not totally finished with the story of Harry Artroon. In fact, what happened on the morning of May 18th, 1980, would in many ways make Harry even more famous than he already was. Because Harry didn't live at the base of just any little mountain. His lodge was situated directly at the foot of Mount St. Helens, which was an active volcano. The government operation that federal agents and local law enforcement were trying to run here was an evacuation. They were not trying to impede on Harry's rights. They were trying to save him. But Harry was so convinced that the land he loved so much, that he had lived on for nearly 60 years, would not hurt him. And so he ignored the authorities' repeated warnings. But Harry's decision was the wrong one. And on May 18th, he paid for his mistake. Because that morning, Mount St. Helens erupted, sending an avalanche of searing lava and mud directly onto Spirit Lake and his lodge. And remains were never found. 57 people died during this eruption. Today, in that area, Perry has both a trail and a ridge that are named after him. So in a way, he remains a part of the mountain that he loves so much. Thank you so much for watching this video. And remember, we have a whole playlist of This Week in Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time.
I'm at 36. And I got that kilo. Oh, don't tell me I'm starting to lag now.
Always like to make an impact. Pointer at the time.
Don't tell me I'm starting to lag now. Please don't do it. Please don't do it. Please don't lag now. Oh my god, no. Don't start.
There's dissension.
Come on. Don't start. Don't start. Don't start.
Okay, we just wrapped up the 15 city live tour, like literally. My first day
Did
back
I
in
just
the
prestige
studio.
my? Oh no, I thought I prestiged my gun. I got excited. I just made clutch. That's all that was.
Strange dark mysterious person. That was really cool. But I knew
So if my gun did this
one
shit
story
again, I got too
had
excited.
to tell. First off, once I got back in the studio, it's the one I'm doing right now. It is the final story from the set list from the tour. If you didn't see the tour, well, you're in luck. You're seeing the best story of the tour. Now, technically, we briefly covered this story like 4.5 years ago. However, it was terrible. I went back and looked at this video, and it was just poorly put together. It's like really short, and so many of the key parts of the story were just omitted because I didn't know what I was doing. But now I sort of do, and this story was completely broken down, restructured, rewritten, and the end result is this totally horrifying, like, encore story from the live tour that I really think, even if you've heard the OG before, you're gonna love this one. This one, by far, the biggest reaction from the thousands and thousands of people that watched this live. Okay, so this is called
OMG.
What's in the Basement, and it's really good. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button you're going to gift them tickets to my first ever live storytelling tour. But don't tell them you got the tickets that are mid-row 4 seats to the Indianapolis show. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications
again?
so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story.
I have all the freaking perks. That's also a first.
In the fall of 1986, Frank Bowen, along with his 2 daughters, Tina, who was 15,
Oh, I'm so
and
glad this is
Karen, who was
recorded.
9, they experienced just a terrible loss. So Frank's wife and the girl's mother suddenly passed away from cancer. And so that in and of itself was obviously tragic and terrible, but what made it even worse is that, you know, she had been a working mom, and her income was a vital part of just making ends meet in the Bowen household.
Sorry, I
And
just
so as
can't
soon as she
combine
passed away, as much as Frank just wanted to be there for his girls, to help them grieve the loss of their mother, he really couldn't. He started immediately having to pick up all these late night shifts at his job, again, just to make sure financially the family was whole. And so it's like within days of the mother passing away, Frank is out late at work, and these two poor girls are just stuck at home by themselves, just totally grief-stricken and alone. And so in October of that year, on one of those nights where Tina and Karen were home alone and their dad was out working late, these girls, I mean, you got to remember, they desperately miss their mother. All they want is to just have one more interaction with her. I mean, they can't believe that she's gone. They were so close with her. It's like their whole lives have been turned upside down. And so on this night that they're home alone, you know, putting themselves to bed, they start talking about how, man, I just wish there was just a way to communicate with Mom. And at some point, one of the girls says, wait a minute, maybe there is a way to do that. So the girls owned a Ouija board, and a Ouija board is basically a way people believe they can speak to the dead. It looks sort of like a phone board. It's got letters and numbers on it, and it's got a yes and a no on there. And there's this thing called a planchette, which is basically like this little free-floating dial, almost like a pointer that you place on the board. And people that use the Ouija board will place their fingertips right on the edge of the planchette. And they will literally just say things like, you know, if there are spirits in the room with me right now, you know, give me a sign. And in theory, if there are, you know, the spirits will move the planchette around, so people have their fingertips on it, but they're not controlling it, and it will move around the board and land on yes or no, or spell things out, or give numbers. It's just a way people believe they can speak to the dead. And so Karen and Tina are like, why don't we get our Ouija board out and have a seance? Let's try to communicate with Mom and see if she manipulates the board and gives us a sign that she's here with us. And so Tina and Karen, they get their Ouija board, they go down into the basement of their house, they lay it out, and they put their fingers in the planchette, and after a minute, you know, one of the girls is like, hey Mom, are you here with us right now? And they have their fingers on the planchette, but nothing happens. So again, the girls kind of wait a minute, and Mom, if you're here with us right now, please, anything, just even a little, show us you're here with us right now. Nothing happens. And so over and over and over again for over an hour, the girls just sit there asking every combination of question that they possibly think of, trying to elicit a response from their mother, who they so want to believe is like with them right now, she's looking out for them. But no matter how earnestly and passionately they ask these questions, the planchette faded. So the seance was worked. And so the girls, you know, it's not clear if they literally believe they were actually going to get a reaction from their mom. But, you know, this was pretty disappointing. It was like another reminder that, you know, Mom really is gone. And so they packed up their Ouija board, they were very frustrated, and they went upstairs to their respective bedrooms on the second floor of the house, climb into bed, and they try to go to sleep. So their father is still out at work, he won't be home for some time, and the girls know this. They know that they are home alone until they fall asleep. And so they're laying in their bedrooms, it's totally dark and quiet. As they're laying there, the girls begin to hear a tapping sound coming from somewhere in their house. Now, it was clear to them that the tapping was not coming from the floor of the house they were on. It was coming from somewhere either on the first floor or maybe down in the basement. But, you know, at first, the tapping sounds didn't really alarm them at all. It just sort of sounded like, you know, house sounds at night. The sound of machines whirring or clicking, or maybe branches outside striking the side of the house, or who knows what. But they seemed sort of like harmless sounds that you would expect at night. However, as the tapping sort of persisted, you know, it wasn't really a consistent tapping sound, it was more sporadic, but it was consistently sporadic, like it was obvious whatever this was, it wasn't stopping. You know, as that continued, the girls began to tune in more and more to it and started wondering, what is this? And at some point, the younger of the two girls, Karen, the 9-year-old, she started to get spooked. The sound was kind of freaking her out. And so she got out of her bed, and she left her room, she goes down the hallway, she comes into Tina's bedroom, and she goes up to her big sister, and she's like, Tina's like, yeah, what is that? And so the two girls, they leave Tina's bedroom together, drop to the hallway, they can still hear the tapping, it's kind of coming from downstairs somewhere, and the girls, they walk to the top of the stairs, basically looking down the stairwell that wraps down to the first floor. They can't see the first floor, they can only see, you know, the halfway point, the landing. And they're hearing the tapping sound coming from somewhere down there, and the girls are just kind of listening, not really reacting. And at some point, one of the girls says, wait a minute, what if this tapping sound is Mom? What if the seance we did worked? What if she is here and now she's giving us a sign that she's with us right now? What if it's her? And so feeling sort of excited all of a sudden, one of the girls just says, "Mom, is that you down there?" And immediately there's a response. Tap, tap, tap. Something from downstairs is reacting to their question. And the girls are psyched. This is what they wanted when they did their seance. All they wanted was some interaction with their mother, and they think right now they're getting it. They're talking to their mom.
Oh
And
my
so after
God, wait,
getting that
no.
tap, tap, tap response, one of the girls asks another question. Mom, if it's really you, give us another sign. Really show it's you. Tap, tap, tap. Something for sure is interacting with them downstairs. And the girls 100% believe it's their mother, and again, they are thrilled. And so the girls, they start walking down the stairs, firing off more questions to their mom, and even though some of their questions weren't really yes or no questions, they would always get that sort of tap, tap, tap response. Like, again, something's interacting with them. And as they made their way down to the first floor, and they're hearing this tapping, and they're sort of following it around, it eventually brings them to the head of the stairs that leads down into the basement. And they open up the basement door, and they're asking more questions, they're getting those tap responses, and it's clearly coming from downstairs. And even though the girls are really excited, it's gotta be Mom, they weren't so confident that they were prepared to go down into the basement to follow after this tapping sound. So they sort of stop at the top of the stairs, looking down into the basement. It's gotta be
I'm
Mom,
playing
but
too much.
it's still a little bit frightening to go down there. And so they stay
Sorry,
there,
Mr.
right above the
Zombies.
stairs, looking into the basement, just
I'm not playing
constantly
with y'all
asking
lives like
questions and getting responses from down in the basement from Mom. It's great. And eventually, after 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever it was, the tapping was stopped. The girls continued to ask their questions, but there was no longer any reaction from the basement. And so at that point, the girls, they're so excited. They really feel like they've been talking to their mom, and they're so jazzed up from this experience that they're like, we're not going to be able to sleep. And so the girls just stay awake in the kitchen until Frank comes home from work. And when Frank comes inside, he sees his girls are awake, it's like midnight or whatever it is. He's sort of surprised. But the girls rush up to him and they're like, "Dad, you wouldn't believe it. We had a seance, and we heard this tapping sound, and we know it was Mom. Mom is with us right here. We were talking to her." Now, Frank, he's totally caught up with everything they're saying, but he also knows that these girls, they're going through this horrible time in their lives. They've just lost their mother. He can't even imagine their level of grief. He's obviously grief-stricken, but this is their mom. And so he's seeing his girls for the first time in what feels like a long time, looking really happy and excited, and they're telling him that tapping sounds in the house are their mother. And so Frank, he's not going to pick holes in what they're doing. He's not going to question, what's actually happening in the house. Instead, as soon as they tell him all this stuff, he just goes, "You know what, girls? Of course your mom is here. Your mom will always be here. She will always be looking out for you. Your mom is with you right now in the house, I'm sure." And so the girls were so happy. Again, this was such an amazing experience. Their dad also agreed this is so good. And so the girls, they happily go upstairs to their bedrooms and they go to sleep. And Frank, truthfully, after having this exchange with his daughters, didn't really think much of it. Again, he's sort of thinking that, there wasn't really tapping sounds coming from his deceased wife. This is just some coping mechanism that the girls are using to deal with this tragedy. He thinks, it's helping them out, it's making them happy. What's the big deal? So Frank actually goes to bed. Over the next few days, the tapping sounds in the house would continue. And they were no longer just coming from the basement. They were also coming from the kitchen. They were coming sometimes from the second floor. They were sort of coming from all over the house. But the girls were the only ones who could hear the sounds. Like every time they'd hear the tapping, if their dad was home, they'd call him over, but Frank wouldn't hear anything. Now again, Frank doesn't really believe that there's actually tapping happening. He doesn't think this is actually real at all, but he's playing along with it because, his girls are happy, clearly this is their coping mechanism. And so again, Frank's not thinking much of it, it's harmless. The girls are frustrated, they can't hear it, but again, it's overall still a very good thing. It's Mom. Mom is trying to communicate with them. However, after a few days, post-seance, as the tapping continued, the girls began to change their attitude about the tapping sounds. The first day, and over those first few days, it really did feel like a good thing. This is Mom. This is positive. This is definitely a good thing. But after about 72 hours, post-seance, the girls began to sort of feel frightened by the tapping. because the tapping no longer was really just coming mostly from the basement. It now started coming almost exclusively from their bedrooms at night. So they'd be laying in bed and they'd hear, tapping underneath their beds. They'd hear tapping in their closets. And it was frightening. And they would call their dad in and he'd come into their bedrooms and he wouldn't find anything. But now, Frank, who previously had just sort of let this continue, this is his girl's coping mechanism for this terrible loss. Now he's seeing that his girls, they don't really think it's mom anymore. They don't know what this is. And it's also disrupting their sleep. And so now it's not a healthy thing anymore. This is a problem. Like, it's disrupting his girls' lives. And so Frank begins at this point, 3 days post-seance now, he begins telling his girls, like, hey, come on guys, there's nothing to be scared of here. These tapping sounds are just normal house sounds. You're overthinking it. Like, there's nothing that's gonna harm you in the house. Mom is definitely here and looking you, but she's not making those tapping sounds. You gotta let this stuff go and just forget about this stuff. But the girls, they're like, Dad, we're not making the tapping sounds up. Just because you don't hear them does not mean they're not real. And they began to tell their dad, like, we think the seance worked, but we actually no longer think it's mom that's sort of come out of the seance. We think we unlocked a different spirit, an evil spirit. And now that evil spirit is haunting our house. And so Frank, at this point, he's like, guys, that's not what's going on here. You really need to stop. Like, these tapping sounds are not real. They're in your head or they're normal. And so Frank and his daughters really began to fight over this because the girls, they know they're hearing sounds and Frank's like, I'm not. And so they're really starting to fight over it. The girls, they're getting more and more frightened just being in their house, in particular at night when these sounds would typically start. And so fast forward about a week after the seance, and now the girls really are so scared to be in their house because of this tapping, which they believe is this evil spirit in their house. They're finding all sorts of excuses to just stay out of their house. Like when dad's at work late, they're trying to stay at their friend's house and not be home because it's too frightening. And Frank, he's sort of at his wit's end with what to do with his girls. Because now this thing that's going on in the house, this delusion, as he believed it was, that his girls were suffering from, it was really disruptive and unhealthy. And he began telling his girls, like, if you can't stop with this whole tapping delusion, you're gonna have to go to grief counseling. Like, this is too much. And so, again, fast forward about a week here, and that's what's going on in the Bowen household. And on this particular day, the girls, Tina and Karen, they didn't have a place to go that night. They didn't have a friend who was available. And so they're home at their house, alone. Frank's out for the night doing a late night shift. And the girls, they're in their kitchen just kind of hanging out. They're pretty anxious here. And they start to hear tapping sounds coming from the basement. Now, by this point, the tapping sounds were so common that just hearing the tapping sounds was not like this horribly frightening thing.
I made it to 41,
it was just sort of this very unsettling thing where nobody knew what they were. And again, the girls think it's something evil. But on this night, that the girls are alone, their dad's gone,
That's wild.
Tina, the older of the two, she says to Karen, like, Dad doesn't believe us. He does not believe that there's tapping sounds in the house. And so we, right now, need to go down in the basement and investigate. Because if we don't, no one's ever going to look into this. Like, nobody believes us. And Karen is horrified at the idea, Karen's the 9-year-old, of going down into the basement, to go see what this tapping is, but she doesn't want to be away from her sister, and so she's like, okay. And so Tina gets a knife from the kitchen, she goes to the door, to the basement, Karen follows right behind her, and Tina, she opens up the door, and the two girls begin going down the steps. And once they get to the bottom of the steps and they're in the basement, it's just this kind of blank slate down there. There's a washing machine and a dryer, there's some boxes, but it's just sort of a blank, sort of open, nothing cellar down there. And the girls, when they got down there, they're looking for the origin of this tapping sound. And on some level, they expected to find something that was making these sounds, because they've been hearing these sounds. For them, it's not a delusion. Like, every time they hear these sounds, they are real to them. Just because their dad doesn't hear it does not mean it's not real to them. And if you look at the beginning, when they first started hearing the sounds, they thought it was their mom. And they never really fully investigated. They maybe didn't want to find out that, perhaps the tapping sound was, a washing machine or something. Because that would destroy the illusion that it was their mom. So they never fully investigated then. And then the next few days after that, when it sort of transitioned and became a scary thing, the girls also never really investigated because it was scary. They didn't want to know what was making this tapping sound. And so now, here we are, a week into this, and they've gone down into the basement where they've heard the tapping sounds, and they're like prepared to see something that is making this sound, because it's real for them. Like maybe it's a raccoon or some animal that's gotten into their house, but there has to be something, because they hear these sounds. But now they're looking around this basement, and there's nothing. There's nothing that could possibly be making this sound, and the girls are horrified. And so after being down there only for a couple of minutes, Tina, who's got the kitchen knife, she's like, Karen, let's get out of here. This isn't right. Let's get out of here. And so the girls turn around and they begin going back up the steps. And as they do, they notice something on the stairway wall that they didn't see
and it's
on the
lagging
way
for
down.
me. Yeah.
Written in red on the wall are the words, "In your closet, come find me."
His controller has to die. His controller has to die. There's no way.
Sprint up the stairs. They bolt
Kill
out
the
of the
one
house.
next
Go
to
to their
you.
neighbor's house. Start banging on the neighbor's door. The neighbor comes to the door and he's like, "What's going on?" And the girls are like, "Oh my God, we had this seance. We've been hearing tapping in the walls, and now somebody's written on the walls. We don't know what's going on." And the neighbor is so confused, really doesn't
Kill
understand
it.
what's happening. And he's like, "Look, girls, just come into my house. You're safe here. We'll wait for your dad to come home. He'll know what to do." And so the girls, they're hysterical. They go into the neighbor's house. They shut the
he
door.
over it.
and
He
they
gotta
wait.
just be over
And then
it.
a little bit later, Frank Bowen, their dad, he comes home. The neighbor immediately flags him down and calls him over. And he's like, "Look, here's what happened. Your girls came over. They said, something about writing on the walls. I don't know." And Frank's like, "Okay, all right." And he tells his girls, like, "Look, stay here. You're safe here. I'll go check the house and make sure nobody's in there." Frank at this point in no way suspects that there's anything, evil or bad in his house. He thinks this is just a continuation of this delusion. The girls are sort of
Oh, it's
acting
out of
out.
ammo.
And so Frank, alone, goes back to his house.
move.
Opens the door, he goes inside.
Okay, no, it's
searches
me.
the house.
I'm lagging.
He looks
It's
everywhere.
gotta be me.
But there's nobody in
There's
the
no
house.
way.
He does find the writing in the stairwell going down to the basement. It does say, "I'm in your closet, come find me." But it's written in ketchup. And so after, again, searching the whole
Yeah, it's
house
gotta be
and
me.
finding
I'm
nothing
lagging.
other than this writing, Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house. They talk
You
to
have
his
a
girls.
self-revive! Revive
In some ways,
yourself!
He feels like all of this is basically his fault. Like, he should have handled this more aggressively at the beginning and let it get to this point.
Hey, I
So
had to make sure it
tells
wasn't
us
me, and
what
I'm
it's
not
like.
tripping like I'm
I
not
know
here.
that you wrote those words on the wall. I know that all of this is sort of a delusion that's
I had to
playing
make sure
out
I
that
wasn't
started
alive and
with,
was somehow just
something
letting
good. You
myself
thought it
die
was
over and
mom,
over again.
But now it's become something that isn't good. It's disruptive. You've convinced yourself the house
has
is
a
haunted.
self-revive. Y'all
and
see it,
I'm
right?
very worried
No,
that
y'all
this is a
can't see it.
product
My
of
thing is blocking
grief.
it, but he
Like,
has a
grief
self-revive.
is leading you to do these things, and it needs to
Revive
stop.
yourself!
And so starting tomorrow, you're going to go into grief counseling. We need professional help here to make sure you girls are taken care of. I should have
Revive
done this from the
yourself!
beginning.
You have
so
a
we're gonna make that happen.
self-revive!
Now, the girls knew they didn't write that on the wall. They're not making the tapping sounds. But they also knew their dad 100% didn't believe them. Like, zero. And it was not going to change. And on some level, like,
Is it
they
him
think maybe
lagging
there's
or me
truth to what he's
lagging?
saying. Maybe they are so grief-stricken that they've convinced
Or is this a
themselves
kid
that
playing
things are not
now?
real.
Because
And so
bro
in
was
this sort of
fine as
vulnerable
fuck a few
moment,
minutes
the
ago.
girls are totally upset about what they've seen and what they've heard. They just tell their dad, like, "Fine, whatever, we'll go to grief
What?
counseling." And so sure enough, the next day, the girls would start
Oh, now you gotta
counseling.
play. Okay, yeah,
and
so
right
they had to-
away,
somebody else
all
had
the
the
tapping
controller.
in the
That had
house,
to
all
be
the
it.
writing on the walls, all that
Because now
stuff
bro can move and
stopped.
everything.
Like, peace returned to the Bowen household, at least at first.
Just keep training them for a second. Keep training them. And then blast all the niggas. There we
As you
go.
may already know, I recently was on tour. Me and my team spent 4 weeks traveling in a bus around the country, telling stories live to thousands of people. It was totally incredible and surreal. But I've got to say, the best part of the whole experience was just getting to interact with you all in person, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. And also, pretty much everybody
That was
turned
a
out in
good
flannel.
game.
There was like a sea
That was a
of
good
thousands of
game.
people rocking the flannel. Because basically at this point, the official uniform of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious is the flannel. And guess what? I have a surprise for you that has to do with flannel
Amazing.
just in time for the holidays. I am so excited to share that our brand new official
He had them
Mr.
things,
Ballin
though.
flannel is now for sale on shopmrballin.com. But hurry, because quantity is limited. This is a first come, first served situation. But it's not just a flannel. we actually have a whole new collection for the holiday season. And they include things like the Mr. Ballin Christmas sweater. We also have a hat, we have a hoodie, there's a blanket, like a flannel blanket, there's ornaments, there's stickers, there's pins.
Now looking
much
prestige
more.
again.
But don't wait too long to buy this stuff because this is a holiday drop, which means if you want it in time for the holidays, you gotta order now. So again, head on over to
Which one?
shopmrballin.com to pick up your official
Oh,
Mr.
shit.
Ballin flannel,
Okay.
along with all the other great stuff we're dropping for the holiday season. I can't wait to see some of you guys rocking the flannel the next time I go on tour. Happy holidays, everybody. Okay, back to the story.
Oh, so I
Fast
get to
forward
pick what my
3
levels
weeks
will
to
be
December 8th,
when I pack a punch.
1986.
That's
So this is
fire.
3 weeks after the girls began their therapy, and
So I
in
got
those
the
3 weeks, the
room.
Bowen household is totally calm. There's no more tapping, nothing. Everything is fine.
I want this one.
But on December 8th, Frank, along with his 2 girls, Tina and Karen, and their friend, Kathleen, they had been out for the evening, maybe getting ice cream or going out to eat or whatever, and they come back to the Bowen household. And when they do, it's nighttime, so it's dark outside, and Frank, he goes up to the porch, he goes to the front door, and as he's about to open up the door, he looks through one of the windows of his house, and he sees there are several lights on in the house that he didn't remember leaving on before they left. And so he just thinks, like, that's weird. Like, I could have sworn I turned those lights off. He's kind of looking back at the girls right behind him, sort of wondering if maybe they left the lights on, but he's like, no, that's weird. So he unlocks the front door, he swings the door open, and immediately he sees this scene inside of his house that makes no sense. The TV is on, a radio is on, and furniture in the first floor of the house where he's looking has clearly been moved. Not dramatically, but things have been moved around on the first floor. Like if you live somewhere, you know where things go. Things are off. And Frank, like he's seeing this, and he's sort of looking back at Tina and Karen, and he's like, did they do this? Are we back to this whole delusion? You gotta remember that even though it's been 3 weeks now of peace in the Bowen household, Frank is all too aware of how insane it was right before then. You know, with the girls, writing on the wall, at least according to him, and thinking there was an evil spirit in their house, and, he's thinking, is this them? Like, somehow did they do this? This feels sort of like a continuation of that. He's looking at the girls, but he's thinking to himself, like, they've been with me. We've been out of the house. How could they do this? But again, Frank is sort of caught. On the one hand, he knows this could be his girls, but he's also thinking that's not possible. And so in that mind state of sort of being caught between these two opposing ideas, Frank, instead of backing out of the house and calling the police like anybody else would do, he instead just begins like walking into the house, sort of nonchalant,
That
like
black
not
is
really sure
fire,
how to
too.
react. And he begins this sort of half-cocked search through the house. And the whole time, Tina, Karen, and Kathleen, they see what's going on, and the 2 daughters, they're terrified. I mean, they're all too aware of all the tapping and the writing on the walls. They're thinking, this is real, it's happening again. And so they're tucked up right behind Frank, who again, Frank is like in shock. He's just like wandering through the house like, what's going on here? Turns the TV off, he's walking around, turns the radio off, he's moving furniture back around, and he can't believe it. And so he does this weird, like again, half-invested search through the first floor. He doesn't find anybody there. He goes to the second floor, does the same search. Again, all 3 girls, the 2 daughters and the friend, they're right behind Frank because they're so scared.
All right, I'm cold.
They do the search of the second floor, nobody there. They search the attic,
gonna watch this
nobody
for a
there
second
either.
with me.
They go down to the basement, nobody in the basement. Like there's nobody in the house. And so Frank is like, what is going on here? And then he remembers there's actually a room on the first floor of the house that he forgot to search. It was just a front room of the house right off the front entrance. When he began the search, he just sort of overlooked it because he was sort of in a daze. And so he's like, okay, I'll go back up there and I'll search that last room and then I'll know the whole house is secure. Nobody's here. And so Frank goes back up the basement stairs to the first floor. The girls are tucked up right behind him, still so scared. And he makes his way towards this room, and this room overlooks the front of the property. There are windows looking out to the road. It's just
I'll
you
be right
walk
back,
in,
guys.
there's windows,
I
there's
need
the front of the
something else to
house, and there's a little closet over to the left. It's like a sitting room. And so Frank, he goes into this room, and right away, he sees on the wall right in front of him, written in shaving cream, are the words, "Marry me." And so Frank, he walks over to the words, and he's staring at them, being like, what is this? Like, who wrote this? The girls, again, are right behind him, tucked up against the back of his legs. and he's staring, and as he's doing that, he hears movement in the closet in the room that he's in. And Frank turns and he looks at this closet. The doors are open to this closet, but it's a dark closet, and out of the closet walks a man who was wearing a dress, Frank's dead wife's dress. This person had clown makeup on their face, and they were wielding a hatchet. And they walk out of the closet, and they look at Frank, and they look at the girls, who are so shocked, they're just in silence, staring back at the sky. And this person looks at Frank and goes, "You and the girls, go upstairs." And so Frank immediately goes into protector mode, and he gets between the maniac and his girls, and he just tells the girls, like, go up the stairs, do what he says. And the hatchet-wielding maniac just sort of walks along, following after Frank and the girls. Again, Frank sort of staying between this person and the girls. And so Frank shepherds the girls up the stairs, and he's like, "Go ahead, girls, first bedroom, go in the first bedroom." So they go upstairs. All three girls go into the first bedroom. So Kathleen, Kara, and Tina. And then Frank, he goes into the bedroom, and the maniac's right here in the hallway about to follow after Frank. And as soon as Frank gets in the door, Frank shuts the door and holds it shut, and there's suddenly this struggle between the maniac in the hallway and Frank. The maniac's trying to get in, there's this vicious struggle, and Tina, who's already in this bedroom, just turns, runs, and leaps out the second floor window. And so she smashes to the ground, she runs next door to that neighbor's house, she slams on the door, the neighbor comes out, and Tina's screaming about, "There's someone in my house!" And so the neighbor at this point knows this is a real emergency, they call the police, and then minutes later, the police show up, and when they get there, they look up at the Bowen household, and Frank Bowen is leaning out of that second floor bedroom, and he's screaming to the police, "Hey, there's somebody in here. He was just at my door. He's gone. I don't know where he is." And police, they get over, they put a ladder up to the window. Frank comes down, they get the other two girls down, so everybody is safely out of the house now. They've been moved over to that neighbor's house, and now the police are going to go into the Bowen household to find this dress-wearing, hatchet-wielding, clown makeup-wearing maniac. They're going to find him and put him into custody. And so the police,
Is that him?
they go into the Bowen household, guns drawn, and they search that entire property, top to bottom, and they find nothing. Nobody's there. The house is completely vacant. However, they would find a hatchet lying by the back sliding glass door, and the back sliding glass door was partially open. And so ultimately, again, when nobody is found inside the house, the police decide, like, well, clearly this maniac, if there really was a maniac, is now gone. Because look, the door's open, the hatchet's here, so they're gone. And so the police, they go over and talk to Frank and his family, and they're like, "Look, we don't really know what to make of this. We didn't actually see, this person you claim to have seen in your house. I'm sure there was somebody, but we didn't see them. And so for now, what we're going to do is we're going to monitor your property 24/7 and just see what happens, see if anybody comes in or out. We'll make sure nobody comes to this property. And we'll also begin an investigation in town to try to figure out, who this maniac was. And in the meantime, you and your girls go stay with a family friend or something. Just don't be here because we don't know what's going on here." And so Frank and his girls, they went and stayed with a family friend, and the police began their surveillance of the Bowen household. And for 2 days, nothing happened. Like, nobody went in or out of the Bowen household, and despite police canvassing the town and trying to figure out, who this maniac could have been, they really didn't get anywhere. Because remember, Frank's description and the girl's description of this maniac was, probably a man wearing a dress with clown makeup on, and so effectively this person had a disguise on. Like, there was nothing to go on. So they couldn't find anybody in town, there was no leads, and nobody has come to this house, and they're communicating with Frank Bowen the whole time. Like, basically, nothing's coming of this case. And so finally, 48 hours after, confronting this maniac in the closet, Frank and his girls, they've been at the family friend's house this whole time. And Frank's like, "You know what, it'd be great to get my toiletries and a few other things from my house," because basically they evacuated their house and didn't get a chance to pack or anything. And Frank's thinking, like, nothing's going on at the house. There's no leads in this case. It's got to be safe to go back to my house for a minute and get the things I need. And so he tells his girls to stay with his family friend, and Frank, by himself, goes over to his house, and it's broad daylight, and he's expecting to find a police officer, who's monitoring his property, and he can tell the officer, "Hey, I'm just going in real quick to get my stuff," and they would, let him go in and do that. But when he got to his house, he looked around, and he didn't see any police officer outside the property watching the property. And he's thinking like, that's pretty weird. They told me they've been watching my property 24/7. Like, where are they? But Frank's like, that's weird, whatever. So he gets out of his car and begins walking towards his front door. But as he's walking, for a second, out of the corner of his eye, he can swear he can see somebody moving in the second floor of his house. But when he looked up, nobody was there, but he was certain somebody had been moving around up there. And Frank's thinking to himself, like, wait a minute, are the police monitoring my house from the inside? Is that what they're doing? They've been in my house? I could have sworn they said they were out of my house. And Frank's like, you know what, just in case, I need to call the police, because I don't want to walk in there and startle an armed police officer who's basically looking for an intruder. And so Frank, he goes to that neighbor's house and uses their phone, and he calls the police, and he's like, hey, are you in my house? Is that what you guys have been doing? You've been monitoring my house from the inside? And they're like, no, we have been watching it from the outside. Very likely what's happened here is you've arrived at your house at the exact moment when there is turnover happening between the police officers who are watching it from the outside. Meaning the officer who's been watching your house must have just left, and the incoming officer who will be taking over the next shift is probably on their way, or maybe they're there right now. And in fact, what you should do, Frank, is hang up with us, go back to your property, and very likely the officer will be there or be there soon, and you can talk to them and have them search your house just in case to make sure nobody's in there. And so Frank says, okay, he hangs up the phone, he goes outside, and sure enough, now there is clearly a police officer in a car outside of his property. So Frank goes over and, explains the situation to the officer, and the officer's like, no one's going inside your property. Literally, we have watched this property 24/7, save for a couple of minutes here and there when we're doing turnover, but nobody's gone in or out of your property. But either way, Frank, I'll search your house just to be sure. And so Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house, and this officer goes up to Frank's door, he opens it up, he looks inside, and he can't believe what he's looking at. In the first floor of Frank's house, it's just madness. There are pennies glued to the ceiling of the first floor, and the furniture clearly has been moved all over the place, but it's been stacked in these sort of weird arrangements. And there are glasses of champagne all over the first floor, and there are kitchen knives that have been driven into family photos on the wall. Like the knives are still sticking into the photo, and where these knives have been driven through the photo is always on a picture of either Tina or Karen, the two daughters. And where there are knives in these pictures, above those pictures is written, I'm going to kill you, Tina, or I'm going to kill you, Karen. And so this officer obviously knows, we have a problem here. And so he backs out of the house, he calls for reinforcements. And so all these officers go in, guns drawn, now convinced, clearly somebody has found a way to come in and out of this house, or they're still here, and we have to find them. Like, clearly, the Bowens were not lying about this horrible, maniac that they encountered in the second floor of their house when police first showed up. Clearly, that must have happened, because they didn't do this, somebody else did, and they gotta be here. And so police, they tear the Bowen household apart, looking for this maniac. They look everywhere, and they can't find anybody. There's nobody in the house. And on top of that, it had snowed outside, and before they went in, they made sure they walked around the property to see if there were footsteps coming in or out of the property, and there wasn't. Like, it's not possible what they're seeing. But they've now torn the house up, looking for anything, and they found nothing. Other than, again, the madness they've seen with the furniture, the writing, the knives. That's all they've found. And so after hours and hours of this very frustrating search, a few of the officers found themselves in the basement, and they're just standing there talking to each other like, this is crazy. We must have missed something. Like, what is it? And at some point, one of those officers who was having that conversation, he had his hand resting on the washing machine, and he's just sitting there like, yeah, what did we miss? What did we miss? And suddenly, as he's leaning against the washing machine moved. And so suddenly there's this gap that's been created by moving the washing machine, and the officer looks at the wall where the machine had been sitting before, and clearly there is a hole on the wall. And the officer gets out his flashlight, and he looks in the wall and kind of scans down, and he sees there's this tunnel that's been burrowed in the wall of the basement, and it goes over to the corner, and looking back at this officer is Danny LaPlante. And he's crouched down, he's got a hatchet over his shoulder, he's wearing a dress, and he's staring back at this officer. I'm going to tell you about Danny LaPlante because this story takes a very dark turn. So,
Actually,
Danny
being late,
LaPlante
just
was
tease or
16 years old at the time he was pulled out of the wall. And 6 months prior to being pulled out of the Bowen household's wall, Danny had had this very brief interaction with Tina Bowen, the 15-year-old. Apparently they went to school together or had some interaction in town, but Danny had sort of fallen in love or had some sort of romantic interest in Tina, and he felt like Tina had rejected him. Now, Tina did not remember any of this with Danny. This is entirely Danny's memory of what happened. But either way, 6 months earlier, when he had this sense of rejection from Tina, Danny responded to that by breaking into the Bowen household, cutting a hole in their walls, and burrowing tunnels in their walls. And for 6 months, Danny LaPlante lived in the Bowen household in their walls.
Oh,
now,
he's a
Danny was not
lunatic.
able to access the entire house through the wall in the basement. He could basically maneuver in the basement and partially into the first floor, but in order to get to the other parts of the house, Danny had to leave the wall. And so routinely, over these 6 months that he was in their house, Danny would literally, while the family was home, just get out and wander through their house, like as the family is just living there, and they never noticed him. And so for 6 months,
So
Danny
yes.
spied on that family 24/7. And when the girls had that seance with the Ouija board to try to contact their mother, Danny was downstairs in the basement in the walls watching, and he saw an opportunity. He thought,
gonna go
I'm going to
viral
pretend to
with
be their
that.
mother and screw with them. And so when they heard that tapping sound, that was Danny pretending to be their mom. He was absolutely trying to get them to believe their mother was here. But then whenever Frank was around, Danny would stop the tapping and sort of let Frank believe the girls were making it up. And then gradually, Danny sort of transitioned from it's your mom and it's good to actively trying to terrify the girls. He began tapping at all hours of the night. He began sneaking out of the wall, going upstairs to the girls' bedroom, flicking the undersides of their beds, going in their closet, tapping in their closet, and then making sure to be hidden or escape before Frank came in. I mean, this is absolutely psychotic behavior, but it gets worse. So Danny is taken out of the walls and he's arrested, but then 10 months later, when he is awaiting trial, Danny is released on bail. And while he is on bail, he would sneak into another family's house in Massachusetts, the Gustafsons' house, and unfortunately, that family would not escape Danny. Danny would murder 3 members of that family
he's just
for really
crazy.
no particular reason. He just picked a family and killed them. And so very likely, if Tina had not leapt out of the second floor window when Danny revealed himself in that dress with the hatchet and got them to go up to that bedroom, if Tina hadn't leapt out and if Frank hadn't held off the door like that, almost certainly Danny was corralling that family into that room to kill them with the hatchet. But Tina basically saved their lives. As of this video, Danny LaPlante is still alive and he's serving multiple consecutive life sentences, and he actually recently was put up for parole. He didn't get
Why?
it. He did not get parole.
Why?
But during his hearing for his
Okay.
parole, when he was rejected, he was determined to be one of the most psychopathic inmates in the entire prison system. And now, here is a
Don't you dare.
clip from the latest episode of Redacted. Enjoy.
Alright, y'all.
On June 7th, 1998,
We're listening to
CNN
true
News
crime.
Group CEO Tom Johnson sat at his desk in his corner office, overlooking the massive newsroom in Midtown Atlanta. Below him, the workspace buzzed with energy. Journalists darted between desks, and banks of monitors flickered with breaking news reports. Johnson was in his element to become the most influential source in television news. It changed the landscape for how people learned about breaking news,
And
with
so my goal
correspondents
today
all over
has
the
been
world
just
ready to
to
report
prestige
at a
as
moment's
many guns
notice.
as I can and
It was
prestige
Johnson's
myself
job
as
to
many times
build
as I can.
on CNN's dominance
So that's just
and
what
drive
we
up the
do.
ratings. Johnson turned when he heard a tap on his door. His secretary rushed in and said he had a call from a retired general who was CNN's military analyst. She warned him that the general sounded annoyed. But Johnson was used to putting out fires and dealing with people who were upset, so his secretary's warning didn't
Okay,
alarm
you
him.
can you
As soon
talk?
as Johnson picked up the phone, the general's bristling tone made it clear he was outraged. He told the CEO he'd received some disturbing news. The general had been informed that a segment about a covert military operation in Southeast Asia was scheduled to air on CNN the next night. And apparently this report contained wild allegations about the U.S. military gassing villages, killing
If
American
it's really,
soldiers,
really bad,
and even innocent
y'all can hold it
civilians.
because I'm live there too.
Johnson tried to respond,
I might
but
have to
couldn't
just
get a
end
word in.
TikTok, 'cause this
The
is
general
crazy.
railed that neither he nor
live
CNN's
on
other
Twitch
top
and
military
YouTube as
analysts had
well.
been consulted about such a damning report. Johnson took a deep breath and said that the general was right. They did plan to air a segment tomorrow night about a covert military operation during the Vietnam War. It was the first episode of a new show called CNN Newsstand,
Oh,
a
yeah.
collaboration with Time Magazine.
All right, TikTok. I'm
Johnson
sorry.
assured him
I
the
love
story had
y'all,
taken
but
almost
I'm
a
lagging
year of
back.
careful
Everybody just
investigative
swing over to the
journalism,
Switch.
but nothing Johnson
Nathan
said
say
swayed the
still
general. He insisted
Because
they
this is
pull the
crazy.
show. Johnson wasn't about to back down either. Too much work had gone into the episode about a secret military operation called Operation Tailwind. Besides, CNN had already been promoting it heavily. It was simply too late to pull. There was silence on the other end. Then the general spoke in an ominous tone. He told Johnson he was about to make the biggest mistake in the history of CNN. Johnson stood his ground. He ended the call by saying that the story was going to be a bombshell. Johnson would be right, but the story would explode in a way he never saw coming.
I'm back. I'm sorry, y'all.
We'll remind your sister who she really is. Bonus points.
And then it was gonna make my show lag too. Yes, I've been listening to true crime and playing this game. Why do you get the nuke right now? You get the nuke at the end.
Glad you're back to full strength. Should help the rest of us get there too. Hey, I didn't ask to be first in line. Got no fucking idea why me and Maya got picked.
Why can't I? Oh, I can only hold two. That's right.
Today, we have a very special bonus episode for you guys. It's a collection of 5 true scary stories about real people face to face with.
Oh. No. The lag has gotta stop. I'm sorry, I did not mean to have all of this stuff open. Call of Duty. Forgive me.
real life monsters. Now, these 5 fan favorites have all been completely re-edited for today's episode. So even if you've seen or heard some of them before, this is going to feel like a totally new viewing experience. But before we get into today's 5 stories, if you're a fan of The Strange Gardens,
Come on.
Furious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all.
No, don't lag.
All we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please secretly reverse the like button's car blinkers, so when they signal left, the right one comes on, and vice versa. Also, please subscribe to our channel, turn on all notifications, so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's 5 stories. In 1978, 16-year-old Bridget Geiger was waiting outside her home in Ohio for a boy named Jeffrey to take her to prom. She wasn't particularly excited to go to prom with Jeffrey. He was known to be really nervous around girls, and so she figured it was going to be a pretty awkward date, but nobody else had asked her to go, and she really wanted to go to prom, so she said yes. When Jeffrey showed up, she was immediately disappointed. He was wearing this odd ensemble of vest and bow tie, as opposed to the standard tuxedo that she was anticipating him wearing. So now they were. He was also so nervous that he was visibly shaking. couldn't pin her corsage in the dress. So Bridget's mom put the corsage, half of the corsage was on. Bridget's mom would take a couple of very awkward photos simply standing in front of her house before they ultimately got in Jeff's car and headed home. When they arrived, Bridget wanted to go on the dance floor to see her other friends, lighten the mood because she was not having a good time with Jeffrey so far. But she did stay with him, and it was clear that Jeffrey hated being around this swarming group of teenagers. Bridget felt kind of bad and said, "Hey Jeffrey, do you want to go sit down and just grab a bite to eat over at the little food cart?" Jeffrey's very relieved and says, "Yes, I'd love to do that." And the pair leave the dance floor and walk over to the little food court area. As they're about to sit down, Jeffrey pulls the chair out for Bridget. She sits down, he kind of pushes her in like a gentleman, but then instead of sitting down with her, he just walks away without telling her where he's going. Bridget assumed he was just going to the bathroom, but after a really long amount of time had passed, and it was clear he had not just gone to the bathroom, she got out to go look for him. And so she went on the dance floor, she can't find him in the building, and so she goes outside to see if maybe his car's not there anymore. Maybe he just left. And she sees his car, it's still in the lot. When she turns around to go back into the prom, she sees Jeffrey sitting on a curb eating McDonald's cheeseburgers. And she goes over to him and she goes, "What are you doing out here?" And so he told her that he just wanted to step outside and get a couple cheeseburgers and then come back and he would sit with her while she ate, but they wouldn't let him back in. And so he just got more cheeseburgers and thought he would wait here until she came outside. And now that she was outside, she couldn't get back in either. So she just says, "Hey, I'd like to just go home." And so Jeffrey is mortified and he tells her, "I'm so sorry. I wanted this to be a nice evening for you. I'm sorry it wasn't." He drives her home. He says goodbye. She walks into her house. He drives off, and that was that. Bridget only saw Jeffrey one more time after that. It was about a week after prom, and Jeffrey actually invited her to come over his house for what he was calling a house party. And Bridget's like, "There's no way this kid's throwing a house party. You can barely stand to be around just me, let alone a crowd of people." But she was polite and said, "Sure, I'd love to come to your house party." She gets there and there's no food, there's no music, there's like 3 people there, and as soon as she walks in, all Jeffrey wanted to do was have a seance and communicate with the devil. She was so immediately creeped out by Jeffrey's behavior that after only a couple of minutes, she just turned around and left his house party and did not see him again. Well, until 13 years later when she would read about him in the newspaper. 13 years later, on July 22nd, 1991, Milwaukee, Wisconsin police spot a man named Tracy Edwards running down the road in handcuffs. They run over to him.
Oh shit, we talking about Dahmer.
And he says that a man was holding him hostage in his apartment, that he threatened to kill me. I was able to overpower him and escape, and here I am. The police go to this apartment that he apparently escaped from, and they knock on the door. The door opens, and the police are confronted by this tall man who introduces himself as Jeffrey. He tells police this is all a big misunderstanding, and that Tracy Edwards is a friend of his, and I don't know what's gotten into him. And the police were actually close to believing him. They would even say he was really convinced. But as they're talking to him, one of the officers kind of looks behind Jeffrey into his apartment, and he sees on the coffee table what are clearly pictures of dismembered body parts. And so they arrest Jeffrey, and when his apartment was fully searched, a house of horrors is revealed. In addition to photos of the apartment itself was littered with human remains. There were several human heads in the freezer and the refrigerator, and in his bedroom was a 57-gallon drum containing more dead bodies that were decomposing in chemicals. There was also evidence that suggested Jeffrey was eating these people. Now, Jeffrey lived in a crowded apartment complex, so other neighbors had complained about this awful smell coming from his room, but he had been able to explain it away and convince everybody that it was just some bad meat. However, the most horrifying revelation about how Jeffrey was able to conceal these horrible crimes he was committing in the middle of a city apartment would come a few days later. Apparently, 2 months before Tracy Edwards had run out of Jeffrey's apartment in handcuffs and flagged those officers down, another boy had left the apartment in handcuffs and was running down the road, and police stopped him. But the boy couldn't really speak. He wasn't able to articulate why he was there or what he was doing. And as police are talking to him, Jeffrey comes running up the road, flags the officers down, and thanks them for finding his boyfriend. They had gotten into a lover's quarrel and that everything was just fine. And so the police shrug it off and say, no problem, we'll even give you a ride back to your apartment. And so they drive the boy and Jeffrey back to Jeffrey's apartment. They watch them go inside and the police leave. But if the police had paid a little bit more attention, they would have seen there was a hole drilled in the back of his head by Jeffrey. He had been pouring acid into this kid's head to try to control him, and that was why this boy couldn't speak. And as soon as the police let them go back into the apartment, Jeffrey killed the boy, because Jeffrey, Bridget's prom date, turned out to be none other than infamous serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed 17 people over a 13-year period. Just days after this picture was taken of Jeffrey and Bridget, right before they headed off to prom together, Jeffrey would kill his first victim and start that 13-year killing spree. Dahmer was ultimately given a life sentence, but was killed by another inmate. In 2004, 16-year-old Misty Pastor was a typical American teenager living in Live Oak, Florida, which is a small rural town right in the middle of the state. One Saturday evening in January, she and her mother attended a church service. Afterwards, they hopped in her mother's truck and they got on the country highway and began making their way home. Their house was just 20 minutes down this highway. It was a straight shot, and this highway was pretty desolate.
We need to do this shit together. I don't have my LMG.
It was actually a dirt road despite being a highway, and it was just
these
thick
niggas
forest
clearly don't
on
want
both
the
sides
power
of the
on.
road the entire way. There were no buildings or houses between the church and their neighborhood. Misty's mother was already a very anxious driver. She would keep both hands on the wheel. She would sit up and kind of hunch over the wheel and keep her eyes intently focused on the road. But at night, her driving anxiety would shoot through the roof because she had really bad eyesight. And so she would go to great lengths to not drive at night to avoid that high level of anxiety. But the church service they had just come from had run a little bit long, and so now Misty's mother is driving with the sun starting to set, and she's going as fast as she can to try to get home before it gets too dark. And so as they're bombing down this road at about 55 miles an hour, despite it being about a 40-mile-per-hour zone, Misty
See if you dipshits would have came over
just
here so we
happens
could have
to
pack a
look over
punch
at her mother for no
and get the
particular
fucking
reason.
machine
And
on.
as she's looking at her, she notices out her mother's window, it looks like there's a little girl sitting on the side of the road. What's a child doing out here in the middle of the night? She says to her mom, I think I just saw a little girl. And Misty's mother, who's high up on the wheel, she did not hear Misty the first time. She was just focused on driving and trying to get home. And so Misty says again, I think I just saw a little girl. We need to go back. I don't know what she's doing, but I feel like we need to go back and make sure she's okay. And so Misty's mom looks over at her and she's not prepared to turn the car around. That means staying out later, and it means she's gonna be driving in even darker conditions. And so she's like, did you really see someone? Because we gotta get home. And Misty's like, Mom, I'm pretty sure I saw a little girl. We have to go back. And so finally, Misty's mother, she's very annoyed, but she stops the car, she does a three-point turn, and she begins driving back up the road where they came from towards this girl. Now, they had only made it about a half mile from where Misty believed she had seen this girl. And so pretty quickly, they slowed down because Misty said, I think she's in this area, and they both began scanning the right side of the road, exactly as you can see now that they've turned around. Now, it was starting to get very dark outside, but there was enough light, and they had headlights. They were so confident they'd be able to spot this girl. And so as they're slow rolling down the road, they both see this girl a little ways up on the right-hand side. Her back was to the road. She had her knees tucked up to her chest, and she was rocking back and forth. Misty's mother made a comment that it was a little bit surprising that this girl was out here. I mean, there's really nothing around here. There's houses, there's buildings, there's no trails to be walking in this forest on either side. It was just kind of thick forest. And so she just thought it was very strange that this girl would be out there, especially because there's not any traffic on this road. And so Misty's mother began slowly rolling up to her, and she told her daughter that instead of just stopping right away, let's just drive past her and get a look at her, and then we'll turn around and see if she needs any help. And so as they got right up next to her, they realized she's not a little girl. She was a young teenager.
That's what y'all
She's
get.
not a young
I'm not
child.
coming to get y'all either.
And as they drove right past her, they would expect her to turn around and acknowledge the car creeping up on her, considering there's no other traffic in the area, and you're just some person sitting on the side of the road. You should definitely turn around and see what's behind you. But the girl did not acknowledge them. She just continued to have her knees up to her chest and rocked back and forth.
And so Misty and her mother are a little bit freaked out by this, but they drive past her about 50 meters. Misty's mother does a 3-point turn, and when they're looking back down the road, where the girl should now be on their left-hand side, they're oriented back towards the house now, she wasn't there anymore. But there were no streetlights. It was now almost completely pitch dark outside. So all they had was headlights. And so Misty told her mom, drive up a little ways. Maybe the girl stood up and moved, and we just can't see her because she's not in the headlights. And so Misty's mom began driving down the road and kind of turning slightly towards the left to shine the light more to the left. But there was no sign of this girl. For good measure, they turned right slightly to shine the lights more to the right-hand side of the road, but there was no sign of this girl. And so Misty and her mother just slow rolled back down the road, kind of keeping their eye out on both sides. But after traveling for several minutes, going about 5-10 miles an hour, and seeing no sign of this girl, they decided that, well, she must have just gone back into the woods and gone back to wherever it was she came from. And so Misty's mom began picking up speed, and before long they had gone maybe 2 or 3 miles away from where they'd seen this girl, and they were coming up to this 4-way intersection with stop signs all around. And as they were getting close, Misty's mother gasped, because on the other side of the intersection, on the right-hand side, was this girl sitting on the side of the road. She's got her back to the road, her knees are up, and she's rocking back and forth. And so Misty's mother pulls up the stop sign and then just sits there. And both women are just stunned at what they're looking at. They had just seen her 2-3 miles back down the road. It wasn't possible for her to get all the way up here. And so Misty's mother looks at her daughter and says, do you think it's a different girl? And Misty's like, no, that's the same girl. And so they just sat there for a minute until Misty started to panic. And she said to her mom, Mom, don't stop. I got a bad feeling about this girl. I don't know what's going on, but you can't stop next to this girl. But Misty's mom, she was definitely weirded out by this situation, no doubt. But she didn't feel good about abandoning this girl in the middle of the night on the highway. And so even though she felt a little bit hesitant herself, she told Misty, we have to run after her and ask if she's okay. That's the least we can do. And Misty was not having it. She said, Mom, do not stop. I got a bad feeling about this. Don't stop this girl. But Misty's mom got across the way and began slow rolling past this intersection. And now at this point, Misty is just absolutely terrified. She puts her seatbelt off and she goes down to the footway right in front of the seat. And she closes her eyes and covers her ears, and she just continues to beg her mother to just please keep going, don't stop. But her mother just continues on until she stops right next to this girl who's still just sitting on the side of the road with her back to the road. She's got her knees up, she's rocking back and forth. She's not acknowledging Misty or her mother. And so Misty's mother turns to her daughter and says, please roll down your window. And Misty refuses. She's still down in the footwell, still in the fetal position. She's crying and she's still begging her mother to please just go home. And so Misty's mother, frustrated, reaches across the passenger seat and grabs the knob to roll down the window manually. So she rolls the window down, and Misty, who's down in the footwell, all she remembers is sitting there covering up her ears, and she's crying, and she opens her eyes, and she's looking up towards her mom, who's reaching over the seat, and her mom yells out to this girl. And Misty remembers looking at her mom, who suddenly pulls the door and screams, and then they take off like crazy, flying down the road. And Misty jumps out of the footwell, and she's looking at her mom, and she's like, what's happening? What just happened? What did you see? And her mom's got her hand over her mouth, and she's speeding down the road, and she's crying now, and she's looking at Misty, and she just doesn't have the words to describe what she just saw. And so Misty's asking her mom, what did you see? What happened? And finally, her mother just said, she didn't have a face. She didn't have a face. It was hollow. There's nothing on her face, and she looked at me. And so Misty screams, and she's crying, and her mom is crying, and they speed home. They're home just a couple of minutes later, and they run inside, practically falling over each other to get in the house. And as soon as they get inside, Misty's mom calls 911. She didn't even know how to describe what she just saw, but she knew it was too embarrassing to try to describe it as some girl without a face sitting by the highway. And so she just told the police that they had seen a girl they think needs help. And so the police, they went out and they searched that entire stretch of highway. They looked for any sign of anybody out there, but there wasn't. There was never any trace of that girl.
How the fuck are y'all all the way over here?
In 2018, a 21-year-old brand new police officer named Derek was dumped by his this breakup caught him by surprise because he actually just recently moved to Colorado.
Colorado in order to be closer to his girlfriend, so naturally he was devastated. After a few weeks of being so depressed and kind of just moping around and going through emotions in his life at this point, one of his very close friends suggested to him, like, hey man, look, why don't you just make a profile on Tinder, the online dating service, and just put yourself out there. You have no idea who's out there. Clearly, your ex-girlfriend was not the one. Derek had met his ex-girlfriend in the bar. Every other girlfriend he'd ever had, he had met in person. So online dating was definitely not on his radar. But he was so lonely and sad, he figured, you know what? I got nothing to lose. And so he made himself a Tinder profile. Derek quickly matched with a woman on Tinder named Leah that he said was way out of it. He wasn't complaining. They chatted for a couple of weeks and thought it was great. So they wanted to get together and actually meet each other in person, but Leah lived well over an hour away from Derek, so it wasn't an actual meeting place. And they're going back and forth about where to go, and finally Leah just says, hey, why don't you just come to my town? There's this great park that I go running in all the time, and there's this awesome field that's on a slope, and you can lay on it and look up through the trees and see the stars. And so that would be a good thing to do on our first date, go stargazing together. So the date night finally came, and Derek was really excited. He was nervous too, because even though they talked on the phone, this is the first time they're going to see each other. And so the plan was he was going to drive out to the town and pick her up from her work. She worked at a hair salon, and from there they would make their way over to this park. So Derek goes up to the hair salon, right with Leah outside, and she's all excited, and she's waving to him. She runs over, and she gets in the car, and they hug and kiss on the cheek. And it's like they knew each other, but they didn't know each other because their entire relationship was online or via texting or a phone call. And so it's like they had history, but they didn't. But either way, Derek was really happy, and it seemed like Leah was too. From the hair salon, it was a pretty short drive to this access road that was going to bring them into this park. And when Leah told him to make this turn, it didn't look like a very well marked trail or even a marked park. It looked like this kind of that Derek would not have associated with a big public park, but he doesn't know the area, and so he turns and he starts heading down this road. And the road went from cement to dirt pretty quickly. And this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, did I take a wrong turn? Does she know like where she's going? This just does not feel like the way you drive into a big park. Finally, they land back on cement, and they're actually on this road that's right up against this huge field. And so right away, Derek stresses out because now it's confirmed in his mind, okay, that's a weird way to get into this park, but here's this huge, amazing field, and we're back on a real road, and everything's good again. Derek asked Leia, where can we park? Because they're on this really narrow road, and there didn't appear to be a parking lot. There also didn't appear to be anybody else on this field or on this road. It's this huge, open, beautiful space, but it did not look well populated or like it was well traveled. But she said, just go right up there. There's a small lot you can pull into. And so Derek starts going up this road, and he sees maybe 300 feet ahead of him are dim headlights of another car making their way down the road towards him. And now it was dark enough that he couldn't really make out what kind of vehicle it was. And so he didn't know if it was going to be some big truck or something like that. And so what he did is he just pulled over as far to the side of the road as he could to allow this vehicle to pass, even though there was a fair amount of distance they would need to cover before they were passing. He figured just give them the right of the road. And so as they start moving forward, you can see that it's actually this big van, and they're moving pretty slowly, and he's just kind of waiting for them to pass, and he's not thinking anything of this. He's thinking that this is just another person at the park. And this van, instead of passing him, actually turns at the last second and almost goes bumper to bumper with Derek's car. He doesn't crash into it, but he stops just in front of Derek's car. And so Derek is a cop. He's a brand new cop, and he's super aggressive. You know, he really believes in his training. And so as soon as this guy stopped in front of him and blocked the path for him, red flags are going up for Derek, and he knows something's wrong with this van. And instinctively, he says, Leah, stay here. He grabs his flashlight that he kept right in the center console, and he jumped out of the car and went right to the driver's side door of this van to confront this guy. And when he got up to the driver's side door, it was this really big guy who looked pretty startled to see Derek come charging up to him with his flashlight. And Derek's like, what are you doing, man? What are you blocking me in for? And the guy's like, oh, hey, sorry, I'm the caretaker here of this whole property, and we've had an issue with poachers in the area, and I was concerned you guys were poachers. It doesn't look like you poach stuff. And Derek's like, no, we're not poachers. We're going stargazing. I'm on my first date here. And the caretaker's like, I am so sorry. Please get back in your car, go and enjoy your night. And at that, he backed up, did a three-point turn, and drove right back up that road where he came from and disappeared down on the other side of the hill. Derek stood in front of his car for a couple of minutes, making sure this guy was gone, and then he turned around and he got back in the car, and he kind of joked with Leah, and he's like, yeah, you thought we were poachers. poachers. I guess you look like a poacher to him, and that's why he stopped us. But when he looked over at Leah to react to his hilarious joke, she wasn't paying attention to him. She was just furiously typing away on her phone, which Derek did think was a little bit odd. You'd think that she'd be more interested in this strange thing that just happened. Some weird guy just blocked us in, and I'm confronting him. You'd think she'd be interested in that on some level. She might want to know what I said to the guy and what he said to me, but she didn't seem to care. She was just really invested in whoever she was typing on her phone. And so Derek thinks, whatever, and just throws the car back in drive and continues up the trail the way they were going before they were stopped. So Derek continues down the road just a little ways until he sees a little dirt lot that's butted up against this huge field they're going to be hanging out on for the night. And so he pulls into the lot, backs into a space, and he and Leah get out, and they put a blanket out right next to the car, but on the grass on the hill. And they get their food out, wine out, and they sit down, and very quickly they're telling stories, laughing and stargazing, and they're having some wine, and everything's really great. After about an hour, it's totally dark outside, and Derek is laying on the hill facing back towards his car and towards the roadway. And he notices to the left, up at the top of the hill, so the same area where the van had come from originally and where it went back to after they spoke that one time. Derek is looking out there and he sees headlights, and it's the van. And now the van is driving down the road, not leisurely like it was before, but it's flying down the hill. And before Derek or Leah have a chance to react to this van barreling down on them, it comes flying into the parking lot and practically hits his car and comes to a stop where it's boxing. So even as he got in his car, he couldn't drive away. And so Derek jumps up, Leah jumps up, and the guy, the caretaker, talking before, he hops out of the driver's seat and he walks around the front of the van. He's got this pipe in his hand and he looks at Derek and he's like, "Give me your keys and your wallet." And again, Derek is this brand new cop. He's 21 years old. He's not about to let this guy push him around. And so he doesn't do anything. He doesn't know what he's going to do. He doesn't do anything at first. He just looks at this guy. He shows him that I'm not going to fall over because he told me. But then Derek is given a huge curveball when Leah, his date, stands up and runs over to this guy and stands next to him and turns around and looks at Derek and goes, "Come on, give us your keys and wallet." And Derek's like, "Great, you get to set up on my date. So I spent the past 2 hours with her. I had a connection with this girl." And so now Derek is just standing there doing nothing, not to be tough, he didn't do his job. He feels so betrayed. He just feels like, how could this happen? And in that moment, Leah walks to the back of the van, and she gets a metal pipe. She comes back around, and she goes, "Derek, give us your keys and your wallet. We don't want to have to hurt you." And this is when Derek looks at them both, and he goes, "No." And as soon as he said that, the big guy tackles him. He gets thrown to the ground, but Derek can handle himself. And very quickly he did get up, and he drew his concealed carry pistol, and he's aiming it at the big guy in the back of Leah. And he said, "Yeah, I'm a cop. Go ahead and put your hands up now." As soon as they saw the gun, they both dropped their pipes and put their hands up. And so as he's holding them both at gunpoint, he's looking over at Leah like, "Really? You did this to me? Are you kidding me right now?" As he's doing that, he has to get his cell phone out of his pocket, type in 911, and then called dispatch and had to say who he was, what his badge number was, what happened, and where he is. And where he is was difficult to describe. And so as he's trying to explain these directions, and he's saying, "Oh, yep, go left at the light, and then there's a gas station there. You're gonna go up to the field, you're gonna see me, I got some people at gunpoint." As he's doing that, Leah and the caretaker look at each other, and they just turn around and bolt. They figure he's distracted. We can at least get behind the van and run into the forest.
Somebody ray gun, and
so instinctively, he takes off running after them, and he chases them for about 30 seconds into the tree line before he starts hearing gunshots. And we're hit. Someone's shooting at him. He sees the muzzle out in the middle of the forest, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm not doing that." He turns around, runs back to his vehicle, starts it up, and he has to basically smash into the van, back into the fence over and over again, like Austin Powers, at a 25-point turn, before he's barely able to grind his way out and peel out of this park. And so Derek pulls into the nearest gas station. He calls up dispatch and says, "Hey, I just called 911 like 5-10 minutes ago, and I dropped the call because I was chasing somebody. Here's my name, here's my badge number. I'm now at this gas station. Can you send a couple of police officers over to my location now?" And he said, "Yep, we'll send some to you." And so a police cruiser shows up with 2 officers inside that Derek recognized. They were senior to him, and they get out. Catfished and was ready for a state. At the same time, they knew it could have gone really badly. And so they decide they're going to load up in the police cruiser together, all 3 of them, and drive back up to the park. And so they get up to the park, and Derek points ahead and he goes, "That's the van. It's still here." And so they drive up and they stop short of the van. And the 2 uniformed officers, they turn to Derek and they're like, "We're staying here. We're going to go check this van." And so Derek's sitting in the car watching the guys go up to the vehicle, guns drawn. They're looking all around. They're clearly behind the vehicle. They're looking in the wood line. There's nobody there. And at some point, he sees them put their pistols away, and they go in the van. They're kind of shining with their flashlights all around. They're looking in the back, looking in the front. And then after a few minutes, they walked back to the cruiser. And as soon as they got in, Derek could tell there was just something off about how they were acting. When they were down at the gas station, they were kind of joking around with him. Now, whatever they had seen in the van was definitely not something they were going to joke about. And they turned to him and they're like, the back of the van, it was just knives and saws and pistols and rifles and lighter fluid and chains and handcuffs and duct tape. It was just awful, and it looks like there might even be blood on the ground. The two officers immediately called in additional backup, and before long, there was a full-fledged circus around this van of a crime scene investigation unit and other police officers, spotlights set up, and they went out looking in the woods for these people, but they never found the guy, they never found the girl, and Derek would tell the other investigators, hey, she works at this hair salon like right down the road, I picked her up there. And so they went over to the hair salon and they wound up talking to the people there, and they said, we've never heard of Leah. And when they showed them a picture of Leah, they were like, we've never seen her before. And so they came back and they told Derek, look, she's a con artist, and this whole thing, the whole relationship with her has been her setting you up in some way, shape, or form. The entire thing, that's all it ever was. And so for Derek, that was crushing, and he swore off Tinder immediately. He did not want to do any more online dating. But what really haunts him, more than just being taken advantage of, is what would have happened if I wasn't concealed? Would I have wound up in the back of that van?
Did I not just buy drugs?
Simply put, a goth is someone who finds beauty in things that most other people consider to be pretty dark. But most Americans tend to associate the term goth with the teenagers of the late 90s and early 2000s that wore all black and wore heavy black boots and would hang out in cemeteries. And while that representation of goth culture is limited, it is a good representation of the two protagonists in today's story, best friends Rachel and Molly. In the 1990s, Rachel and Molly were full-blown goths. They had black hair, black makeup, black clothes. They had the black heavy combat boots, and at one point they and their other goth friends started hanging out in a cemetery, kind of ironic and funny, like look at us, we're goths, we hang out in cemeteries. And then they actually enjoyed it and began hanging out in the cemetery like every weekend. One Friday night, Molly calls Rachel to go hang out in the cemetery. And as it happened, Rachel was just sitting at home and she was bored out of her mind. And so the call came at a perfect time. And so Rachel's like, yeah, I'd love to go. So she flies downstairs and she sits on her front step and she's waiting for Molly to show up. And eventually Molly's car rolls down the street and Rachel immediately recognizes that Molly is the only one in the car. And Rachel, whenever she would go to the cemetery at night with Molly, they were always there with a group of at least 4 people. Even though they liked hanging out in the cemetery, they did recognize that it was a little bit creepy at night to be out there, and so they liked kind of rolling in a fairly big group. And so Rachel hops in the car, and her first question to Molly is, where is everybody? Is Venus there? And Molly said, oh no, everybody else is either working or over from the party from last night, so it's just us two. I hope that's okay. And at the time, Rachel asked me, I don't really want to do this. But she was like, oh yeah, that's fine. We'll go. Molly takes off from Rachel's house and she makes the familiar kind of winding commute to the front gate of this enormous cemetery that sits right in the center of town. They drive underneath this massive wrought iron gate that looks very medieval, very foreboding. It looks like it's out of a cheesy horror movie, this like cliche entrance to a cemetery. And so they go through there and they're on this road that stretches all the way down through the cemetery and basically splits it in two. On the left side, as you're driving in, was an area closest to town, and also it butted up against a major public university. And then on this side of the cemetery, you had a bunch of residential houses that butted up against the side of the cemetery. And where Molly and Rachel and their crew like to go was on the right side, all the way back in the corner, because there was a section that was kind of situated between these two hills, where not only were they obscured from the cemetery road and the main road once they were down in this little depression, there was also no houses that happened to look over that spot. So it was kind of like the hidden section of the cemetery, and there was also this big boulder that people sat on and a big tree to lean up against. So that was their spot. So Molly drives to the gates, she heads down that road, and she turns right onto a dead-end road. She takes that down about a couple hundred meters till it dead ends, and they park. And then the girls get out of the car, they light up cigarettes, and they walk down the hill that's just beyond where this dead end comes to an end. So they walk down this hill, and it brings them to this clearing where this big rock and tree is. Rachel hops up on the rock and she turns around, so she's facing back up the hill they just walked down, and Molly is right next to her on the right, leaning up against the tree. And for the next hour or so, they just crushed cigarettes and talked about their various boyfriend drama and life drama and whatever else they wanted to talk about. After a while, the girls started to smell a bonfire, and from where they were sitting, they could see a hill in front of them, and there was actually another hill over here. And so their view is pretty obscured out of this valley they're in, so they can't see any fires anywhere. And so they assumed that what they're smelling was a fire coming from the other side of the cemetery, because there's that huge university over there, and they knew sometimes the college kids would come onto the cemetery and they would light fires over there, and inevitably the police would get called and they would break up the fire because you're not allowed to fire on the cemetery. And whenever they did that, the police would actually make rounds around the entire cemetery, and historically, basically, if you were there hanging out, they would tell you to leave. And so they think, okay, this is probably a good time to leave, because probably in the next 30 minutes to an hour, the police are going to be here, they're going to come over here, see our car, and they're going to ask what we're doing, and we're going to have to leave. So let's just leave now. So Rachel hops off the rock, and the two of them begin meandering their way back up the hill towards the car. When they get about halfway up the hill, they notice to their right something bright. Now, because they were higher up, they could actually see over the hill to their right. And what they were seeing was the top of a bonfire. So the girls take a couple more steps up the hill to gain some elevation and hopefully be able to see better down into where this fire is. But even though it's almost at the top of the hill, that fire is too far down on the other side of that hill that they can't see any people, and they can't really tell what this fire is. They're just basically seeing the top flickers. Even though they don't know anything about the people over there at this fire, what they do know is when they showed up, there was no fire over there. They would have recognized it. So whoever's over there had to have shown up and built this fire while Rachel and Molly were down in the tree. Which means there's a pretty good chance they didn't see Rachel and Molly. This is a pretty private area. Their car was parked a little bit off to the side of the trail, and so Molly can tell them. She says to Rachel, hey, let's sneak back down and walk up their hill and look down and see who's here. I bet it's a bunch of college kids. It'll be funny to see what they're doing. But Rachel had a weird feeling, thinking to herself, if this is college kids, why would they have their bonfire this far away from campus? I mean, this is literally the farthest point away from the side of the cemetery that's close to them. If they're having a party over here, there's a good chance that anybody going to it is going to need to drive. And that just doesn't make sense if you can just walk to the other side of the campus and have a bonfire over there. And so Rachel is logically deducing that this is probably not college kids. But who else is having a bonfire in the secret section of the cemetery in the middle of the night? And Rachel's thinking that now, if the police come here, they're definitely going to see us because we're so close to this bonfire, and so it's probably not a good idea to stick around much longer. But despite Rachel's hesitations, she is intrigued, and she does want to see what's going on over there. So the two girls walk down the hill, they make it down to the rock and the tree, and they turn left, and they begin walking up this other hill, the hill that's going to bring them up to this fire. And so they only get a few steps up this hill when they are suddenly hit with this disgusting, putrid smell that just encompasses them and it makes them gag, and they're covering their mouth and their nose, and Rachel exclaims, "Oh my God, what is that?" And as soon as she says it, she realizes she was really loud. And she's like, and Molly's like, and they both freeze, wondering if the people on the other side of the hill have heard them. After a little bit of silence, Molly's like, "Going?" And Rachel's like, "We gotta go." Between the horrible smell that's obviously coming from this weird fire and the fact that Rachel basically just gave them away. And so for all we know, the people on the other side of this hill have heard us, and now they're waiting for us to come over the edge, and it's going to be really awkward if we suddenly crash their bonfire. Rachel is thinking about these things, and so she's like, let's go, we gotta go. Molly's disappointed, but she gets it, and the two girls turn around and begin walking back. And so they walk past the tree, and they walk to the left, and right, out to walk up the hill that's going to bring them to their car, and Rachel just turns around to look at the hill towards the fire where they were headed before. And standing at the top of that hill is a man just looking down at them. and the fire is illuminating him from behind. You can clearly tell as the man standing there looking at them. And immediately the girls felt really uncomfortable. It was almost like they had just been caught spying, even though they didn't actually get caught spying, which was what they were going to go do. And so they felt like they had almost been caught red-handed. And so Molly and Rachel just turn and begin walking up the hill, kind of with their heads down. It just felt kind of awkward. And so they move a few more steps up the hill, and Rachel looks again at where this guy was standing, and he's now gone. And Rachel's relieved, but then she realizes he's gone because he's walking, power walking, down the hill towards them. And Rachel's fast, and she grabs Molly and pushes her and says, go, 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 go. And they start running up the hill, and Rachel looks around, and now this guy is running towards them. He's down now at the rock and the tree. He's gaining on them. They sprint up over the top. They run to Molly's car, and Molly's fumbling with her keys to get the car open, and Rachel's yelling, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. Finally, she gets it open, and they both jump inside. Rachel locks the car doors, and as Molly is turning the key over, Rachel's looking out the back, and she's waiting to see this guy. And sure enough, as they pull off, she sees his head come up over the ridgeline, just enough that he can clearly see them leaving, and then he ducks back down and he disappears. And the two of them speed down the road, they make a left onto that main drive, and they speed out of the cemetery. For the first few minutes of the drive, neither of them say anything. This was just a very traumatic experience, and it was also very confusing, because they thought they were going over to spy on college kids having a bonfire, and then they're hit with that horrible smell. Like, what was that horrible smell? And then they leave, and there's this guy who did not look like he was a college kid. He looked like he was probably in his 40s, and then he's chasing them. You know, and when they did start talking about it, they couldn't really come to any sort of rational conclusion of what had just happened. And so they were both very spooked, and they decide, let's just go home and talk about this. And Molly's going to take off her house,
and this big motherfucker's behind me.
The next morning, Rachel gets up and she heads down to the kitchen where her mom is already there having her morning coffee. And Rachel sits down, and you know, she's not a big talker. She's not about to start by saying, hey, guess what happened to me last night at the cemetery. Instead, she just sits there, and for a little bit, her mom just kind of rambles about work and what she's doing that day. And then all of a sudden, her mom, it's like she has this epiphany. And she goes, Rachel, did you hear what happened last night? And Rachel's like, no, what? And her mom's like, someone I work with. I don't know her personally, but she works in the same building as me. She got kidnapped from the parking garage where I parked my car. I have seen her park her car in this lot, and she got kidnapped. And Rachel's like, oh my God, really? Like, what happened to her? Did they find her? And her mom was like, yeah, but it's too late. The person who had kidnapped her had killed her and then tried to dispose of her body in the cemetery by burning her in a bonfire. Rachel suddenly felt sick because now she knew what was happening that night. And she knows what was smelling. Rachel immediately pours her heart out about everything that happened the night before, and her mom is totally horrified, but she's in particular horrified that they clearly had been there when the killer had arrived and set up shop and began burning his body. They were just literally 50 meters away the whole time. And so her mom tells her, you and Molly have to go to the police station and make a statement. They have not caught this person yet. You've seen this person, you've got to tell them. And so Rachel calls Molly and breaks the news about what was actually happening in the before and who was actually chasing them to their car, and says, we have to go to the police station. So they agree, they go down to the police station and they tell them what happened. But they didn't get a great look at him. They could only say that he was maybe in his 40s and maybe average height. And so the police wrote it all down, but they basically said, look, if you can think of more details, we would love to. And so the girls go back home, and they're thinking to themselves, did he see us? Does he know that we saw him? Do you think he knows that we know he's a killer now? And so they're freaking out. But luckily, within 48 hours, the police actually caught this guy because he was driving around in the murder victim's car, and someone spotted him. They pulled him over, and he confessed, and so he went to jail. Needless to say, Rachel and Molly thanked their lucky stars that when they started ascending that hill and they were hit with that smell, that Rachel said, let's not go any farther. Let's leave. Because had they continued and gone to the other side, they could have wound up in the bonfire too. The following stories all take place in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. On New Year's Eve 1980, 20-year-old Karen Potak was out at a bar with her friends celebrating, and at some point in the night, she slipped out and slid into Sandy later, and she began walking home. Now, she didn't have a jacket on, and it was very cold outside, and she's kind of stumbling through the streets, and a man sees her and pulls over and offers to give her a ride home. She's kind of intoxicated, and so she agrees to get in his car, and they drive off. A couple hours later, around 3 a.m., the police receive this phone call.
Yes, please, this is an emergency. Please send a squadron. Pierce Butler Road, Molenberg Manufacturing Company, machine shop. Please, there's an ambulance too. There's a girl who's...
Oh, I think this is the Weeping Voice Killer.
She's laying on the ground in the back by the railroad tracks, by the airfield.
What's the address?
I don't know.
Who are you?
Using this information from the caller, police arrived at the back of the motor. She had been repeatedly bludgeoned over the head with a tire iron. Miraculously, she did survive, but because of her head injury, she forgot almost everything about that night, including the description of the guy who picked her up, and who probably attacked her, and who probably was the one who called police. So the police tried to interview some people in the area around where she was found, but it was a really deserted area, and no one knew anything. There was no physical evidence left on the scene, so the case went cold. Then, 5 months later, the police received another phone call.
Finally, I just got somebody with an axe. I can't stop myself. I can't kill somebody.
At this point, the police were not connecting this call with the call that immediately preceded finding Karen Potak, meaning they did not think that was the same person. And since in this call there were no instructions on where to find this person, they didn't really have anything to go on, so they took note of it, but ultimately kind of disregarded it. But just a few hours later, a group of teenagers were walking through the forest when they found the dead body. The body belonged to 18-year-old Kimberly Thompson, who had literally just moved to Minnesota. She graduated high school and decided she wanted to start fresh in Minnesota. She hops in a bus, she goes to Minnesota, she gets off the bus, she goes to the first restaurant she sees, which is a diner. She sits down by herself, she's eating some food, and a man approaches her and says, "Hey, can I sit down with you?" And so she lets him sit down and asks, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And she says, "Oh, the police here." And this guy offers to drive her around town and show her the sights. And she's like, "Great." 15 minutes later, he would kill her with a knife. At this point, police are beginning to suspect that this person who keeps calling them immediately before they're finding women that have been attacked might be the same person. And 2 days after Thompson was killed, they had another call that confirmed that.
Don't talk this way. I'm sorry, I couldn't help it. Don't know why I had to stab her. And I kind of... I just didn't go to her dream. I can't believe I just big dream. I can't think of being locked up. If I get locked up, I'd kill myself. I'd rather kill myself than get locked up. I'll try not to kill anybody else.
Okay.
From this point forward, they referred to this caller as the weepy-voiced killer. And even though they had his voice recorded, they didn't have any physical evidence. They didn't leave any at the scene with Compton either, so they didn't have much to go on. The police would go to the diner and they would talk to the staff that was there, and they would give a general description of the weepy-voiced killer, but it wasn't enough to pinpoint a suspect. So once again, this case went cold too. 6 months later, the police received yet another call.
Fire emergency.
Please don't talk to him, boyfriend. I'm sorry, I killed. I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly Compton was the first one.
Is this not? What is the next level on this gun?
A day later, they find the body of 4-year-old Barbara Simon floating in the Mississippi River, tucked up against a brush. The night before, Barbara had been out at a bar and she'd offered a cigarette to the man. They began flirting and kind of hit it off, and at one point they were going to leave together, and before they left, Barbara turns to one of the waitresses and kind of jokingly says, "Boy, I hope it's nice because I'm leaving with him." And the waitress, for whatever reason, had a really bad feeling about it and made a point of getting a really good look at the man she was leaving with. And that man, of course, would turn out to be the weepy-voiced killer, and as soon as he and Barbara left the bar, he would stab her to death and throw her in the Mississippi River. After the police began investigating this, they came to the bar and they interviewed that waitress, and she said, her a really good look at this guy, and so the police show her 100 different mugshots of previously convicted felons in the area. And she immediately identifies 38-year-old Paul Stefani and says, that's the guy. Paul has been convicted for aggravated assault and also has a history of mental illness. Paul is immediately put under surveillance, but within 24 hours, he manages to ditch his tail and goes straight into downtown Minneapolis, where he picks up 19-year-old street worker Denise Williams. Paul took her down a dark alleyway, and she kind of sensed something was wrong. And so she grabbed a glass bottle that was sitting on the floor of the car. And when he went to attack it, she managed to hit his head and cut his face really, really badly. And she managed to protect herself enough that she could get out of this car and the neighbors saw her running out of the car and kind of saw the whole exchange, didn't like how it looked, so they called 911. Police showed up, all was gone. That same night, police get another call from the Ouija voice killer.
Where?
1505 Westminster.
1505?
Yeah.
Westminster, what's the problem?
I'm all cut up. I got beat up.
What's your apartment number?
208. I'm bleeding.
208, where are you bleeding from?
From my arm, my face, my head.
Now, by the time this call is being made, the audio recordings of his previous phone calls had been made public. They were aired on radio shows, on TV. People had heard his voice, and it's fairly distinctive. And the dispatcher recognized his voice and told police there's a chance the Ouija voice killer just called him. So an ambulance comes and picks up Paul Stefani and brings him to the hospital, and when he's sitting in his hospital bed, police walk in and they apprehend him. He pled not guilty, and prosecutors did not actually have that much evidence connecting him to each of these attacks. They had these audio recordings, but that was about it. And so ultimately, he got 58 years in prison, and not a life. But considering his age, it wound up functioning like a life sentence. 12 years into that sentence, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer and was told he only had a year to live. And so over this time, he confessed to all of the attacks, including one they didn't know about. He murdered 33-year-old Kathleen Greening in her own home. He just didn't make a phone call to police afterwards. Paul would die shortly after his confession.
Well, damn, Paul.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now.
No, dude.
Looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time? Well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Oh, he got, thanks. Thank God he got it. No, it's way too quiet. Why am I lagging? Oh no.
Today, is a very special bonus video for us. It's a collection of
Am I out of ammo in it? Oh my God, I am.
I have true crime stories. The first story over here is actually a story I told on a live stream. It's the only place I've ever.
I'm Gary. Go pack a punch too with
Publish the story, so if you missed the live stream, you missed the story until today.
Why I keep lagging? Fuck. Chat, am I lagging for
Pulled
y'all?
that story out of the live stream footage. We edited that story.
YouTube is tweaking.
Free, and it's going to be included in today's video. The other 4 stories, fan favorites, and some of the most disturbing cases we've ever covered. Now, even if you've seen one of these 4 episodes before, don't worry, it's completely re-edited, so it will be like a brand new movie experience. But before we get into those 5 stories, if you're a fan of the stories dark and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week.
Oh,
So,
yeah,
if
I'm
that's of interest to
lagging.
you, please offer to fill up the like button's new water bin. But instead of using water, use quick drying cement. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly videos. Okay, let's get into today's story.
I'm tweaking. I got through this with nothing but an LMG before.
On June 7, 2008, a middle-aged woman named Kim Spengler was working at this family paint shop. She worked there, she'd been there for several years, and she was stocking shelves, going about her day, when one of her colleagues came up to her and tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Hey Kim, there's an alarm going off in the parking lot and we think it's your car." And Kim, immediately when she heard this, she became totally panicked. She thanked the colleague and said, okay. And then Kim, she went to the counter where she stacked her purse. Keys, and she put the keys into her fist like brass knuckles. She put the key kind of pointing up out of her hand, and so she's kind of holding her keys like a weapon, and she makes her way towards the door. This is in North Carolina, suburban North Carolina. It was in the middle of the summer, super hot, and she's got these keys in her hand, and she steps outside into the blazing heat, and she can hear the alarm going off, and she looks and she can see it's her car. It's definitely going off. But for Kim, it's like she wasn't really focused on the car. She's sort of anxiously looking around the parking lot, looking for any sudden movement. She's looking if anybody's coming up to her. I mean, she's totally on edge. And the reason for this is because recently Kim had left a very toxic relationship with her boyfriend, a guy named Ricky Simmons, who was 49 years old. Ricky and Kim had connected 5 years earlier, when Kim was going through a really dark time in her life. She was struggling with substance abuse. She was just at a low point, and Ricky also was sort of at a low point too in his life. He also was struggling with substance abuse. He had just gotten out of jail. He had served time for manslaughter, in fact. And Kim, I think that she basically looked at him as being sort of like a troubled soul, but somebody that still had a heart of gold in their somewhere. There was a kinship there. There was a relatability. And so that was 5 years ago from this point in the parking lot with the car alarm. However, a few months earlier, Kim had gotten the strength and become sober. And when she became sober, well, one, Ricky didn't like it. Ricky was sort of not an advocate of hers at all. So they ended up breaking up, and it was a very rocky breakup. Kim at first thought that Ricky would sort of just get over it, but Ricky began effectively stalking Kim. He began showing up at her apartment unannounced. This was a few months earlier. It got to the point where Kim actually filed a restraining order against Ricky because he was becoming so sort of unhinged. He was so unhappy about what had happened. Breakup. On top of that, there was something else that really was sitting in the back of Kim's mind, which was, Ricky wasn't just this unhappy boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. He also was the primary suspect in the disappearance of his son's fiance. He had a 22-year-old son, and his son was born in Australia. And around the same time that Kim broke up with Ricky not only became sort of obsessed with Kim and became her stalker, but he also sort of began a lot of the same behaviors with Jamie, again, his son's fiance. And about a month after Kim and Ricky had broken up, Jamie went missing, and Ricky was the primary suspect in her disappearance. And he was actively being investigated for her disappearance. So, from Kim's perspective, she knows that Ricky is, he's an ex-con, he served time for manslaughter, he knows that he's being investigated for this disappearance. And so she's constantly on edge here. Despite her restraining order, she does not feel like that's actually going to keep Ricky out of her life. She's very scared of him. And so when her alarm went off, her first thought is, it's got to be Ricky. Maybe he's broken into my car. Maybe he's setting a trap for me, whatever it is. And so as she goes outside, that's what's going through her head. Anyhow, she gets out the parking lot, keys in her hand, and she's looking around, but she doesn't see Ricky. Big open parking lot, bunch of cars, she sees her car. And so she flips the key fob and turns off the engine, and there's her car that's going off. And she walks through the parking lot, and she gets to her car, and she is careful, she's walking up to it, making sure nobody's hiding, But when she gets to her car, she sees there's no damage. The car is not damaged, all the windows are rolled up. certainly no sign that anybody broke into her car. And so Kim is thinking, okay, clearly what's happening here is somebody must have just bumped into her. Like this has happened to with Ricky. This is just, I'm on edge, given what's happening in my life. And so again, she's turned off the car alarm. She checks her car, again, just to make sure, Ricky's not here, and he's not. There's nothing going on with her car. And she ends up going back into the paint shop. And so she goes back in the paint shop, and she finishes up her shift. And by the time her shift ends, which was only a few hours later, she hadn't forgotten about the car alarm thing, because Ricky and sort of the torment he was causing in her life really front of mind to her. And so when she left the paint shop now to go home, she had calmed down, but she's walking through the parking lot, going back to her car, like just hands on edge, her keys, poking out of her hand like a weapon. She gets to her car, and there's nobody there. She immediately hops inside, shuts the door, locks it, turns it on, blasts the AC. It's like she can relax. That she's safe in her car. But as she's sitting there, she sort of took stock of the fact that her car was full of mess. Now, normally Kim was a very organized and clean person. She's very tidy. But really, over the past few months that she'd been dealing with this saga, which was the Ricky saga, she had sort of, kind of fallen off on regular duties, car cleaning, that type of thing. But she knew the next day, Sunday, she was going to church early in the morning, and she had volunteered to drive some of her church friends to church. And so she's thinking, as she's sitting in the car, exhausted from the day, like, oh, okay, the car's kind of smelly, and there's trash, and there's clothes, and there's this. And she's like, I gotta clean out my car when I get home, because I don't want to, roll up to my friends tomorrow for church and have this car be smelly and gross. And so she tells herself, as soon as I get home, I'm gonna clean my car. And for what it's worth, she typically did do that. Most nights, she would clean her car out, take out the clothes, whatever. But, after her drive, finally ended and she got home, she just, she was checked out. And she's like, you know what? I know I need to take out my dirty clothes and take out the trash and clean up, but I just don't have it in me. So I'll just get up early tomorrow, clean up my car, and then I'll go about my day. So she gets out of her car, she goes into her apartment, and she goes to bed. The next morning rolls around, and she gets up, except she sleeps through her alarm. She's late. She looks at the clock, she realizes she does not have enough time to clean her car. She doesn't really have any time at all. She basically needs to run out of the house, get in her car, and drive and pick up her friends, otherwise she's all ready. She sprints out of her house, gets in her car, and right away she's like, oh my goodness, it's so messy, it smells bad, and she starts driving, and she's taking trash and jamming it into the different compartments, doing her best to kind of make it look a little bit more presentable. She rolled the windows down to get some fresh air. But, she ended up picking up her friends for church. And, as soon as they get in, they're very polite. No one's going to call Kim out. They sort of know she's going through a rough time. But it was pretty obvious. They were kind of grossed out by the condition of her car. And Kim's very apologetic.
I'm
so sorry. I'm sorry it smells. I'm sorry it's dirty. I should have taken care of this. Next time I will. And they're like, oh, don't worry about it. And so they ended up going to church. And after church, Kim went off on her own and sort of spent the day running errands. And around 6 p.m., she ends up coming back to her house. She's done for the day. She pulls into her parking space, and immediately she's like, okay, I need to clean my car. This is a full day overdue here. I gotta clean my car. And so she starts cleaning her car. She pulls a trash can over. She takes the trash out of the main cabin of the car. She takes out work stuff and papers. And then once the interior of the car had been straightened up, she went around to the trunk, because in the trunk was her dirty clothes. And so Kim, she goes to the trunk, she opens it up, flips it open, she sees what's in her trunk. So to understand what she found in the trunk, we have to go back 24 hours. So 24 hours earlier, this is back on Saturday, Kim, her car alarm was going off. So it turns out she was right to suspect that potentially Ricky could have been involved with her car alarm, and I'll explain why. Every Saturday, forever, Kim had a very particular routine. Every Saturday, she would go to the gym in the morning, she would change out of her clothes, and she would put her gym clothes in her trunk, put on her work clothes, she would work, and then in the evening, she would get home and take those dirty clothes out and clean them. That was her routine. It was such a routine that, Ricky was aware of that routine. And so on Saturday, when she's at work, when the car alarm went off, it was Ricky. Ricky had broken into her car. Ricky knew that at the end of the day, she's gonna open up that trunk to take her dirty clothes from the gym and bring them inside and do the laundry. But unfortunately for Ricky, Kim didn't do that, right? So Ricky, he breaks into her car and he climbs into her trunk. And in hand is a knife. He's holding a knife. And he closes the trunk on himself, knowing again, based on her routine, that she's gonna open that up at the end of the night and spring out and attack her. But because of Kim's torment from Ricky and how scatterbrained she was, she didn't empty her trunk that night. And so for 24 hours, Ricky stayed in the trunk with that knife. And he eventually cooked to death. And so when she opened it up, he was dead and decomposing in the trunk, still clutching that knife. In addition to that, unfortunately, Jamie Fraley, so Ricky's son's fiance, her body was never found. She was never found. And police still suspect that Ricky had murdered her, but we don't know what happened to her. But what almost certainly happened is simply because Kim did not open the trunk that night, she saved her own life.
Last year, we launched our very first graphic novel, and it went great. I mean, it made the New York Times bestseller list, so thank you all so much for making that happen. But ever since this book came out, we have been